Let's get comfortable and drift into deep, peaceful sleep together. Rain had been falling since before she woke up, and it would go on falling long after she stopped noticing it. That was the nature of rain in this city, in this building, in this particular apartment on the 4th floor, where the windows faced a brick wall, and the light came in grey and thin as old paper. The rain didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with thunder or the cinematic sweep of weather moving across open country. It simply appeared, the way certain kinds of sadness appear, not sudden, not dramatic, just present, as if it had always been there and you'd only just now turned your attention to it. Mara had been awake since 4 in the morning. She knew this not because she'd looked at the clock, but because 4 in the morning was when she always woke up. Had always woken up, ever since the move, ever since the autumn had shifted into something harder and less forgiving than the autumn she'd been promised by this city when she'd first arrived in September with boxes and optimism and the particular kind of naivety that looks, from the inside, exactly like courage. She lay still for a long time, which was also a habit by now, this lying still, this waiting for the ceiling to offer her something, some instruction, some reassurance, some small proof that the day was worth beginning. The ceiling offered nothing, as ceilings do. The heater clicked on. It was an old radiator, cast iron, painted over so many times the surface had gone bumpy and indistinct, and when the heat came on it expanded with a series of small metallic sounds, ticks and pops and one low, mournful clunk that always came at the end, like punctuation. She had learned to find the sound comforting, which she recognised as a mild form of desperation, finding comfort in the involuntary protests of metal infrastructure. But comfort was comfort, and you took it where it lived. She lay in the made bed. She always made the bed, always. Even on mornings she never got out of it, she made it. Around herself, which she understood was not quite sane, but which also felt non-negotiable. The way some deeply embedded habits feel not like choices, but like load-bearing structures. The sheets were white. The blanket was the colour of old moss, thick and dense. Woven in a pattern she'd traced with her fingers so many times she could have drawn it from memory. Interlocking rectangles, each one nested inside the next, all the way to the centre where they converged at a tight, nearly invisible point. She'd bought the blanket at a shop that was already closing when she found it. The kind of shop that sells things you didn't know you needed, heavy things, handmade things, things without obvious origin. The woman behind the counter had been old and specific in the way that very old people sometimes are, specific about small details in ways that felt disproportionate. She'd folded the blanket into a particular shape before handing it over, a precise flat fold that Mara had photographed with. A phone because she wasn't sure she could replicate it, though she never looked at the photograph again because she never needed to. She always folded the blanket the same way. Her hands seemed to know. The rain came down, the heater clicked. She lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about nothing, which was not the same as feeling peaceful. It was more like standing in a room after all the furniture has been removed and realising the room is larger than you thought, and that the largeness is not a comfort but an exposure. She had moved to this city for a job that no longer existed, having been restructured out of existence 6 weeks after her arrival, and she was still here because she'd signed a lease, and because the cost of leaving felt, in some accounting she couldn't quite articulate, higher than the cost of staying. She had savings that were being spent with a slow, steady precision, like sand leaving an hourglass, and she had interviews that didn't become jobs, and she had the apartment and the view of the brick wall and the rain and the heater and the blanket, and she had, in the deepest and most honest part of herself, a growing suspicion that she had made a series of decisions whose consequences she didn't yet fully understand, and that the understanding, when it came, was going to be difficult. She hadn't told anyone this. This was the part she hadn't told anyone. She was 31. She had friends who were, in the easy parlance of the age, killing it. Promotions, partnerships, children born into apartments with more than one bedroom, vacations photographed and disseminated. The whole architecture of a life that cohered, that added up, that made sense from the outside, and presumably she chose to believe from the inside as well. She had a phone full of their evidence. She looked at it less than she used to. She was aware that this was also not a great sign. She smoothed the blanket across her chest and watched the way the fabric lay against her body and thought, not for the first time, that there was something almost architectural about a well-made bed. The structure of it, the way the corners tucked and held, the way the whole surface could be pulled taut and flat, eliminating wrinkles, presenting something clean and resolved, even when the person inside it was neither of those things. The blanket was, she knew, too heavy for October. She had looked at it several times in the past weeks and thought she should switch to something lighter. The duvet was in the closet, practically speaking it made more sense. But she kept using the blanket, kept pulling it up around her shoulders, kept finding it under her hands when she woke at 4 in the morning and needed something to hold on to that was real and present and heavy and there. It was the heaviness she needed, the weight of it across her body. She understood that this was the blanket doing something for her that the blanket could not technically be responsible for. But she found that she didn't care about the category error. The blanket felt like something, and feeling like something was enough. Outside the window, the rain continued its patient erasure of the world. She could hear it on the glass and on the metal lip of the air conditioner she hadn't removed yet. Though it was October, and the air conditioner served no purpose now except to collect rain and block a slice of the already insufficient light, she kept meaning to take it out. She kept not taking it out. This was, she acknowledged, a pattern. She turned onto her side and pulled the blanket up with her, and lay there looking at the wall, which was white and blank, and thought about whether she was going to get up today. She thought about this in a practical, logistical way, the way you think about whether to make a phone call you've been avoiding. The day was out there. It would require things of her. Coffee first, and then the particular performance of personhood that each day demanded, the checking of emails, the updating of applications, the maintenance of the fiction, that everything was proceeding normally, that she was a person with momentum and direction, and not a person who lay in a made bed at 4 in the morning waiting for the ceiling to say something. The heater clicked again, the low clunk at the end of its cycle, and the room settled back into the particular thick silence that rain creates. That sense of the world having been slightly muffled, sound arriving wrapped in something soft. She liked this silence, which she also understood was a problem, or at least a symptom. You weren't supposed to like silence this much. You were supposed to want the noise of people, the clatter of being alive in proximity to other alive things. She had wanted that once. She could remember wanting it. The wanting felt, at this distance, like something she'd read about rather than experienced. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. She hovered in that country just south of sleep, where the body relaxes but the mind continues its small obsessive circuits. She thought about the interview she had on Thursday, the third-round interview at the company whose product she didn't entirely understand, but whose salary would resolve for a while the sand in the hourglass problem. She thought about her mother, who called on Sundays and to whom she said reliably that everything was fine. She thought about a person she used to know, whose face arrived in her mind at these early morning hours with an uninvited regularity that she had mostly stopped arguing with. She thought about the grocery list she'd written on a notepad, and then left on the kitchen counter, and then covered with a coffee cup, and then forgotten about, probably. She thought about the way the blanket felt. This was when she noticed it. The top edge of the blanket had moved. She opened her eyes. She was lying on her side, facing the wall, and the blanket was over her, heavy and present, and the top edge, the fold she'd turned down when she got into bed, that neat 2-inch cuff of moss-green fabric, was higher than it had been. Not much. An inch, maybe 2. Folded against itself in a crisp, nearly geometric line that she was certain she'd not created. She stared at it. Her immediate instinct was that she'd done it herself, in that hovering semi-sleep, some restless adjustment she hadn't consciously noticed. This was the rational explanation, and she held on to it for a moment, testing its weight, finding it adequate. She had moved the blanket. She had done it without noticing. This was not interesting or strange. She turned back over, facing the ceiling again, and lay flat, and the blanket lay flat with her, and she could see the top edge from this angle, the neat fold, and she told herself that she was about to get up. She was about to get up and make coffee and be a person, and the day was going to proceed in the normal way, rain and all. The heater clicked on. She was watching the top edge of the blanket when it moved. It was a small movement, the kind of movement that, if you weren't watching, you would absolutely miss, and if you were watching, you would spend a considerable amount of time trying to explain away. The fold tightened, not dramatically, not with any violence or speed, but with a slow, deliberate precision, the fabric contracting by perhaps half an inch, the crease sharpening as if someone were pressing it flat with a thumb, making it more exact, more finished, more like a thing that had been carefully, intentionally done. Mara sat up. She sat up fast, the blanket sliding down to her waist, and she sat there in the dim rainlight and looked at the top of the blanket, and her heart was doing something she would describe, if pressed, as heightened. Not pounding, nothing so dramatic, just elevated, running a little fast, the way a heart runs when the body receives ambiguous information and is waiting for clarification. She pulled the blanket down, all the way down, off her body, off the bed, letting it fall in a heap at the foot. She sat looking at it. It was a blanket. It lay in a heap the way blankets lie in heaps, formless and inert, a pile of woven fibre on the end of a bed. It was not doing anything. It was not moving. It was a blanket. She got up. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, which faced not the brick wall but the small interior courtyard, and watched the rain collect in the gutter that ran along the roof of the first floor extension and overflow into a thin sheet that fell past the window in a moving, irregular curtain. She held the coffee with both hands. The coffee was hot and real and present, and she was grateful for its uncomplicated realness, its absolute commitment to being exactly and only what it was. She drank half of it standing up, and the other half sitting at the kitchen table with her phone, going through emails she didn't need to answer yet. By 8:30, she had convinced herself, almost entirely, that she had imagined it. This was not, she recognised, a completely satisfying conclusion. To imagine that a blanket moved was a notable enough event to warrant some investigation. She was a person of, she felt, reasonable psychological stability. She slept poorly, yes. She was under stress, yes, the specific and grinding stress of financial precariousness, in a city that offered no quarter to the financially precarious. She was lonely, she thought but did not say, not to her mother on Sundays, not to the friends she texted with declining frequency. But none of these things, individually or together, seemed to her like sufficient explanation for a waking hallucination involving bedding. Still, the alternative was not one she was prepared to entertain before 9 in the morning. She made toast, she answered 2 emails. She opened the window a crack to let in the smell of the rain, which was one of her consistent small pleasures, the metallic greenness of wet city air, and she stood there breathing it in and felt for a moment something like okayness, which was the best she was reliably achieving these days. Okayness, the absence of acute distress. She was familiar with this territory and had made a kind of home in it. The day proceeded. She went out in the rain with an umbrella that only half worked, the kind of umbrella that is fine in vertical rain but has opinions about wind, and she walked to the library because the library was free and warm and full of people who also, by their presence at 11 on a Tuesday, had some complicated relationship with the standard architecture of a productive day. She sat at a table near a window and read a novel she'd checked out 3 weeks ago, and was only now getting to, a novel about a family in a house, which was a novel about many things, and she read for 2 hours, and the reading felt like the best thing she'd done in recent memory, which was also not a great sign, but which she was choosing today not to dwell on. She came home at 2, she heated soup, she applied for a job she thought she probably wasn't qualified for, but which she was applying for anyway, on the principle that you did not know what you did not know, and it cost nothing but the hour it took to tailor the application. She watched part of a documentary about deep-sea creatures she'd seen before, and which she found always soothing, in the particular way that very alien things can be soothing. Their complete indifference to her existence, their beautiful, purposeful strangeness, the fact that they had evolved over millions of years in the dark and were doing fine. By 8 in the evening she was tired in the bone-level way that had become her default, the exhaustion that wasn't quite physical but wasn't quite mental either, the exhaustion of managing, of the daily project of being okay, of carrying the particular weight of a life that was not yet what she'd thought it would be. She made the bed. This was part of it, the evening making. She'd done it so long she couldn't remember starting. She remade the bed before getting into it, smoothing the sheets, pulling them taut, tucking the corners, then the blanket over the top, pulled up and turned down in that 2-inch cuff. She stood back and looked at it. It looked right. It looked the way a bed should look, clean and tight and ready. She brushed her teeth. She turned off the overhead light, leaving only the lamp on the nightstand which threw the room into warm amber shadow. She changed into the grey t-shirt and sweatpants she slept in. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the room for a moment. The rain still at the windows, softer now, the heater beginning its evening cycle of clicks, the lamp making the shadows of things long and gentle. And then she lifted the blanket and got inside and settled down and reached up and turned off the lamp. Dark, rain, the heaters, patient percussion. She lay still. For perhaps 20 minutes she lay still, not sleeping, not thinking in any focused way, letting her mind drift through the shallow water of not quite sleep, and the room was warm and the blanket was heavy and she was, she supposed, as comfortable as she was going to get. She thought about the interview Thursday. She thought about the documentary and the creatures in the dark water with their own light. She thought about nothing. Then she felt the blanket move. Not a dramatic movement, not a lurch or a tug. The same small, incremental creep she'd noticed in the early morning, the top edge tightening, the fold sharpening, gaining perhaps an inch of altitude in the slow, unhurried way of something that does not need to hurry. She felt it against her collarbone, the slight increase in pressure, the edge of the fold pressing more precisely against her skin. She turned on the lamp. The blanket lay flat across her. The top edge was folded back in exactly. The 2-inch cuff she'd turned down when she made the bed. It looked undisturbed. It looked fine. She stared at it for a long moment, her heart doing its elevated thing again, and she reached up and pulled the fold down deliberately, making the cuff 3 inches instead of 2 just to change it, just to establish a new position she would recognise. She turned off the lamp. 20 minutes later, maybe less, the fold had returned to exactly 2 inches. She felt it happen, felt the fabric shift against her chin, the edge creeping up with the slow certainty of something patient, something that was not hurrying because it did not need to hurry, because it knew, with whatever form of knowing belonged to it, that there was no urgency, she wasn't going anywhere, that the night was long and she was in it. She turned the lamp on again and sat up and looked at the blanket, and the blanket lay there, still and dense and the colour of old moss, and the top edge was in exactly the right place, exactly as she would have made it, the crease sharp and neat and perfect. She got out of bed and went to the kitchen and drank a glass of water, and stood at the sink for a while, and then she went back to the bedroom and sat in the chair in the corner. There was a small chair in the corner. She'd had it in every apartment she'd ever lived in, an old wooden chair with a cushion she'd recovered twice now, and she sat in the chair, and she looked at the bed, and the bed sat there, being a bed, which was, she reminded herself, what it was, a bed, sheets and a blanket and a mattress. There was nothing here. She was tired and stressed and sleeping poorly, and her mind was apparently generating experiences that bore some examination. She sat in the chair for perhaps an hour. The rain had quieted, the heater clicked through its cycles, the bed didn't do anything. Eventually she got back in it. She lay there with the light on for a while, watching the blanket with the particular wary attention of someone who's not quite sure what they're looking for but is very sure they'll know it when they see it. Nothing happened. The blanket lay flat and heavy and still. The rain was barely audible now. She turned the light off. Sleep came, finally, the way it came on bad nights. Not as a welcome thing, but as a surrender. The body simply refusing the mind's continued insistence on wakefulness. Consciousness going out not with the usual soft fade, but with something more abrupt, like a door closing. She woke at 4. The heater was clicking. The rain had resumed, or perhaps it had never stopped, merely quieted past the threshold of her sleeping awareness. She was on her back, which she rarely was. She was a side sleeper, always had been. And the blanket was pulled up to her chin, which was higher than she would have put it. She was warm, too warm almost, and the fold was there at her chin, that neat 2-inch cuff, precise and sharply creased. And when she lay still for a moment she could feel, she was almost certain she could feel, the way the fabric held itself. Not loose the way a blanket goes loose when it's simply lying over a body, but somehow deliberate, somehow structured, as if it had arranged itself with a purpose. She pulled the blanket down to her waist. Within 10 minutes it was back at her chin. She didn't see it move. She lay there watching, and she didn't see it move, but each time she pulled it down it crept back up, incrementally, in the dark, in the rain. Slow silence of 4 in the morning, and each time she checked it had returned to its preferred position, and the crease was sharp and the fold was exact and the blanket lay across her with the patient, precise certainty of something that had decided where it wanted to be. She got up and turned on all the lights and sat in the kitchen until morning. This is the point at which a different person might have called someone, a friend, a family member, a person whose voice coming through a phone could establish by its familiar ordinariness that the world was still the world. Mara thought about calling. She thought about what she would say. She imagined the call, the explanation, the pauses on the other end, the careful tone that would emerge, the tone that is not quite concern and not quite dismissal, but something in between, the tone that says I love you, and also I'm not sure what you're asking me to do with this information. She decided not to call. She was not, she told herself, going to be a person who called someone because her blanket moved in the night. By morning she had 3 competing theories, which she'd been developing since approximately 5 a.m, with the focused attention of someone who needs a problem to solve. Theory 1 was that she was imagining it, that the stress and the sleeplessness and the general weight of the past months had produced a hypnagogic experience that felt more real than such experiences usually feel, a waking, hallucination triggered by some combination of anxiety and sleep deprivation and the particular quality of attention she was now directing at the blanket, which might itself be intensifying the experience, the observer effect, the way watching for something can make you see it. Theory 2 was that there was a structural explanation she wasn't seeing, that some property of the blanket's weave, or the way heat moved through the room, or some quality of the way she was sleeping, was causing the blanket to shift in ways that felt intentional but weren't. That were the result of physics rather than anything else. Theory 3 she did not linger on. She pulled the blanket off the bed and put it in the closet and used the duvet. The duvet was fine. It was lighter, less substantial. It didn't have the weight she'd come to associate with sleeping, but it was fine. She slept with the duvet for 3 nights, and the duvet did not move and she slept adequately, not well but adequately, and by Thursday she felt almost normal enough to go to the third-round interview and present herself as a competent and enthusiastic professional who was exactly the right person for this role. And she felt, leaving the interview, that it had gone well, that she had been both coherent and personable, and she rewarded herself with coffee from the place on the corner that charged too much, but whose coffee was, in her experience, worth it. She was in a reasonable mood when she got home. The rain had stopped for the first time in what felt like weeks. There was actual late afternoon light coming through the window, pale and thin but present, and she stood in it for a while and felt the particular small elation of light after extended darkness, which is one of the body's most reliable small pleasures and requires nothing of you except the capacity to notice it. She made dinner. She called her mother and said, as she always said, that things were going well. She meant it more than she usually did. She watched the first episode of something that had been recommended to her and which seemed promising. She went to bed feeling for the first time in a while as though she was a person with some forward motion. She forgot about the blanket. This is to say, she didn't think about it when she got ready for bed, didn't think about it when she turned down the sheets, and so, because the body remembers what the mind has decided not to, she reached into the closet for it without consciously deciding to. She recognised what she was doing partway through pulling it from the closet. She stood there with it in her hands, heavy and moss green, and she thought, no, she thought, I should put this back. She thought these things clearly and with conviction, and then she unfolded it and spread it over the bed. It felt right. It felt the way the bed was supposed to feel. She got in. She smoothed the top edge down into its cuff. She turned off the light. The heater clicked. Outside, the car went past, the first traffic sound she'd heard in hours, and she listened to it until it was gone. She'd been lying there for perhaps 15 minutes when she felt the warmth begin to change. It's difficult to describe precisely. The warmth under the blanket had, until now, been the ordinary warmth of a body in a bed. Her warmth, emanating from her and trapped by the fabric, reaching an equilibrium. But this warmth was doing something different. It was becoming, she would think later, too warm. Not in the way of a fever, not the burning wet heat of illness, but something more even and encompassing. Warmth that seemed to come from the fabric itself rather than from her. Warmth that was, somehow, more present than warmth usually was, more there. And the sound was different. She noticed this because she was the kind of person who, when lying awake, catalogued the sounds around her. The rain she knew, and the heater she knew, and the traffic and the distant plumbing of the building. The pipes moving water through floors and walls on its way to wherever it went. These were familiar, and she heard them as a kind of score, ambient, uninteresting. But now the sound felt closer. Or rather, the sound felt normal, but her perception of it felt contained, as if she were hearing the world from inside something, as if the blanket were not just covering her but enclosing her, creating an acoustic space that was just slightly smaller than the room. She opened her eyes. The room was dark except for the thin line of streetlight that came under the curtain and lay across the floor in a pale stripe. She could see the ceiling, barely. She could see the outline of the window. She could see her own hands resting on top of the blanket, dimly visible. The blanket's surface looked different. She lay still and stared at it. The weave, she had traced the weave of this blanket 1,000 times, knew its interlocking rectangles, the pattern converging at the centre. Weave had lines in it now, subtle, barely there, visible only in this particular darkness where the eye was grasping for information, but lines. Not the pattern of the weave. These were different. They ran along the folds and the edges, following the contours of where the blanket lay over her body, and they had the look. She lay very still and looked at this carefully, wanting to be sure. They had the look of stitching, of deliberate marking, as if someone had taken thread the same colour as the fabric, barely distinguishable, and stitched a series of lines that traced the shape of something. That traced, she realised, her shape. She sat up. She turned the light on. The blanket lay across her, and the surface was the surface she knew, interlocking rectangles, the same weave, the centre point. Nothing extra, no lines, no stitching. She ran her hand over the fabric and felt nothing but the fabric, nubby and dense, the feel she associated with the word blanket, with the concept of warmth and covering and the comfort of weight. She turned the light off, lay back, waited. In the dark, within a few minutes, the lines returned. They were faint. They were the colour of the fabric itself, made slightly different. They required the dark and the reaching eye to appear, but they were there, and they were, she was increasingly certain, in the shape of a body. Her body, or a body her size, outlined in the precise and unhurried way of something that was measuring, that was making a pattern, that was determining the exact dimensions of the space she occupied. The heater clicked. The warmth deepened. The fold at the top edge began its slow, patient creep. She said, out loud, to the room, and the rain, and the ceiling, and the blanket, and whatever else was in the room that was not any of these things, "Stop." The fold stopped. For a moment, for what felt like a moment, everything held. The warmth, the lines, the slow creep, all of it suspended, waiting, as if it had heard. Her. Then the fold continued. She got out of bed. She did not take the blanket off. She simply stood beside the bed in the dark and looked at it lying there, and the fold continued its creep, incrementally, half an inch at a time, in the direction of where her chin would have been, and the lines in the fabric were visible even from where she stood. The traced shape of a body in a bed, her outline, her presence recorded in thread. She stood there for a long time. Then she did something she hadn't planned to do. She reached out and took the top edge of the blanket in both hands, and she unfolded it, pulled it fully down, made the fold flat, eliminated the cuff. One clean motion. She stood there holding the straightened edge, and she felt. There is no other word for it. She felt the resistance. Not physical resistance. Not the sensation of something pulling back against her hands, but something more like the feeling you get when you're the first person to walk across a room that's been arranged a particular way, when your movement through it unders something that was waiting to be undone. A change in the quality of the air, a sense of attention. The lines in the fabric faded. She stood holding the edge for another moment, and then she said, not loudly, not performatively, just as a fact spoken into the room, "I'm scared about Thursday." It felt absurd. It felt like talking to furniture. But she said it to the blanket, to the room, to herself. Because it was true. Because she hadn't said it to anyone. Because she had been carrying it for 3 days in the place where you carry things you don't acknowledge. The place that aches. "I'm scared they're going to say no," she said. "I'm scared it's going to be like all the others." The room was silent. The rain was barely there. A suggestion of rain. The heater had reached the end of its cycle and sat quiet. She stood by the bed holding the edge of the blanket, and her chest hurt a little, the way it hurts when you put something down you've been carrying without noticing. She let go of the edge. She got back into bed. The blanket was still. The warmth was ordinary warmth. Her warmth. The unremarkable heat of a body in bed. The lines were gone. The fold stayed where she'd left it. She lay in the dark, and the rain came and went, and the heater clicked, and she realised, not comfortable exactly, but okay. Not hiding. Not buried. Present in the bed instead of tucked away in it. She slept. In the morning she felt the particular quality of attention that sleep sometimes grants. The way a night of actual sleep can make the previous day look different. Its shadows moved, its objects in new relation. She made coffee and stood in the kitchen and thought about what had happened and thought about what she knew and didn't know, which was considerable and almost nothing respectively. And she thought about the blanket. She thought about the woman in the closing shop, the specific fold, photographed and then never looked at again. The weight of the thing when she'd first picked it up, the way it felt heavier than it should, the way the woman had said, in the particular way of very old specific people, "Take good care of it." She thought about what she'd said the night before. She thought about the resistance she'd felt when she unfolded the edge. She thought, "I'm going to do that again tonight." Whatever that was, the sitting up, the unfolding, the naming of the thing I'm not going to tuck away, and I'm going to do that again. The interview result came Friday morning. An email, polite and thorough, with the word unfortunately placed in the third sentence, after 2 sentences of genuine-sounding praise. She read it sitting on the edge of the made bed and felt the bottom of her stomach move in the familiar way it moved when she received these emails. A lurch that never quite became nausea, but that always threatened to. She read it twice. She put the phone down on the nightstand and she sat there for a while looking at the wall. The blanket was on the bed, made flat and smooth, the top edge turned down in its cuff. She hadn't gotten under it yet. She was still dressed. It was 9 a.m. She'd been awake since the phone lit up with the email notification, and she sat on the edge of it and looked at the wall, and the familiar thoughts began to assemble themselves. The familiar architecture of failure, which she knew well, had mapped extensively, could navigate in the dark. The question of what she'd done wrong, the inventory of her deficiencies, the prospect of telling people, the accumulated weight of time and money and moved boxes and signed leases, and the particular cruelty of hope, which is that it makes the alternative worse by contrast. She sat with these thoughts. She noticed the way they moved through her. Then she lay back on top of the made bed, fully dressed, and pulled the blanket over herself from the side. Within minutes, she felt it begin, the warmth deepening, the fold tightening, the lines forming in the weave, faint as intention, precise as measurement. She lay very still and felt the blanket learning her shape. the edge creeping up toward her chin with its patient incremental certainty. The room was warm. The rain was at the windows, the heater ticked its distant footsteps. She waited until the fold was at her chin, and then she sat up. She sat up, and she gripped the edge of the blanket with both hands, and she unfolded it, one full motion, pulling the fold flat, and she felt again that sense of resistance, of something interrupted, and the lines in the fabric dimmed, and then she held the edge and said to the room and the rain and herself, "I didn't get the job." Her voice was steady. She had been afraid it wouldn't be. "I didn't get the job, and I'm scared I'm not going to be okay." The room sat with this. "I'm lonely," she said. "I've been lonely for months and I haven't told anyone, and I'm telling the blanket, which is insane, but I'm telling the blanket, and it's true. I'm lonely and I'm scared and I don't know how to fix this yet." The last word surprised her. Yet. She hadn't planned it. It arrived on its own, attached to the end of the sentence like something that had been waiting there, patient as the rain. She let go of the edge. She lay back down. The blanket was still. Ordinary warmth, no creeping, no lines. She lay on top of it with her shoes still on, the ceiling above her in its usual blank arrangement, and she breathed. After a while she thought, I have to make some calls, not to say everything, not to perform crisis, not to lay herself open in the way that requires other people to manage their reaction to you and therefore puts you in the position of managing their management, which is the worst kind of exhausting. To say something real to someone. To pick up the phone and say, it's not going well. To give someone the information they needed to be actually helpful rather than performatively supportive. She thought about which friend to call and which of her friendships were currently structured in a way that could hold this. And she thought, genuinely, I need to think about this carefully, which was itself a change from the not calling, the radio silence, the fine on Sundays. She took her shoes off without sitting up, reached down and undid the laces by feel, dropped them on the floor. She lay in her socks on the made bed with the blanket covering her, and the rain at the windows, and she felt, underneath the very real and present pain of the email, a small, specific clarity that she didn't want to use the word peace for, but that was in the vicinity of peace. Something had been put down, not solved, not resolved, but put down. She did not say, just let me disappear. She had felt the sentence come to her earlier, in the first minutes of lying there while the blanket was doing its thing, the sentence arriving with the ease of something that had been waiting. Just let me vanish. Just let me go. Just fold me away. And she had felt the appeal of it, the terrible seductive relief of it, the idea of being tucked so completely into warmth and structure that the world outside the bed could not reach her, and she would not be required to reach back. She had felt how easy it would be to say it, to give the blanket permission. She had not said it. She had sat up instead, and unfolded the edge, and told the truth, and the truth had made the room change in a way she couldn't explain and didn't try to. The days that followed were not better exactly. The job situation did not resolve. She sent more applications. She had 2 more interviews that didn't result in the next round. She called 2 friends, on 2 different evenings, and said the things she'd been not saying, and one of the conversations was hard and good, and one was harder than she'd expected, but still, ultimately, good, and both of them ended with the other person saying you should have told me sooner, which she knew, and which she found she could receive without going too deep into the self-recrimination because she had, she reminded herself, told them now. She talked to her mother on Sunday and said it was complicated. Her mother, who was not a complicated person, but who had raised a complicated person, and had therefore developed, over decades, a tolerance for complication, said, complicated how? And Mara told her, not everything, but enough. The move and the restructuring and the interviews and the months of managing it alone and the way the aloneness had gone from something she could carry to something she was disappearing under. She sat on the edge of the made bed with the phone pressed to her ear, and she talked for longer than she'd talked on a Sunday in years, and her mother listened and said the things mothers say and a few things that were better than that, more specific, more earned. And at the end of the call, her mother said, I'm coming to visit next month, and Mara said, yes, okay, and meant it. She put the phone down and sat for a moment in the quiet. The rain had not come back. It had been a clear week, and probably clear for October running into November, and the light through the window was the low gold of late autumn, a particular quality of light that slants rather than falls, that finds the dust in the air and illuminates it, that makes everything look temporary and beautiful in the same gesture. She sat in this light and thought about her mother coming, and thought about the conversation she'd had, and thought about the application she was going to send tomorrow, the one she thought she was actually qualified for, the one where the job description read like something she could write herself. She turned and looked at the blanket. It lay on the bed in its smooth, flat arrangement, the top edge turned down in its 2-inch cuff. The moss-green surface with its interlocking pattern undisturbed. It was, she thought, just a blanket. She believed she knew, that it was just a blanket, that what she had experienced over the previous weeks was something happening at the intersection of the blanket and herself, something that had required her particular combination of stress and isolation and avoidance to occur, something that fed, if you wanted to put it that way, on the specific quality of disappearance she had been practicing. She also thought, but it moved. She held both of these thoughts. The truth was probably both. The truth was probably that there was something about the blanket, its age, its weight, its origin in that closing shop in the hands of a very old specific woman, and something about her, her state, her practice disappearing, the way she had been using the bed as a hiding place rather than a resting place, and that these two things had found each other in the dark of 4 a.m. and created an experience that was real, that had happened, that she could not entirely explain, and that had also, through whatever mechanism, pushed her toward doing something she needed to do. She smoothed her hand over the blanket. It was warm. It was just warm, the ordinary warmth of something that has been sitting in a room at room temperature. It was heavy in the way she knew, dense and substantial. She pressed her palm flat against the surface and left it there for a moment. Nothing happened. She said, to herself, or to the blanket, or to the room, "Thank you for the wake-up call." Then she stood up and went to the kitchen and started making dinner, and the late afternoon light came through the kitchen window at its slanted angle, and found the steam rising from the pot and illuminated it. And she watched the steam in the light and thought about eating, and thought about tomorrow, and thought about the application she was going to send, and thought, quite simply, and without drama, I am here, I am still here, I am not in the blanket. I am in the kitchen, and the light is doing that thing with the steam, and I'm going to eat something, and then I am going to sleep, and in the morning I am going to keep going. The heater clicked on. The pipes moved water through the building. Somewhere in the apartment block someone was cooking something that smelled of onions and warmth and life going on. She stirred the pot. She set the table. She sat down. Outside the window, the last of the autumn light moved across the sky, and the first stars appeared, barely visible through the ambient glow of the city, but there. Now consider what Blanket Writhe knew, which was not nothing. It had been in the building since before the building was the building, since the site held something else, since the land was different, and the people on it were different, and the quality of their disappearing was different. The disappearing itself was the same, because that is a constant, across times and architectures and the different forms that lives take. People have always had the wish to be tucked away. People have always had the impulse to find the warmest, smallest space and fold into it, until the world stops requiring things of them. This is not pathology. This is biology. The body knows that rest is survival. The mind, which is not always wise but is always inventive, finds its own versions of the cave, the burrow, the nest. Blanket Writhe understood this, in whatever way it understood things, which was not the way of cognition or intention, but the way of a thing that has existed so long in the presence of a particular human impulse that it has become, in some fundamental way, continuous with it. It did not plan. It did not want. What it did was more like respond, a resonance, a tuning, the way a string vibrates in response to its matching frequency. When someone tucked themselves into bed with the quality of disappearance rather than rest, with the specific gravity of avoidance rather than the ordinary weight, tiredness, felt it, and it responded by offering more of what was being sought. It was in this sense not malicious. It was generous. It gave you what you wanted. This was the problem. The old woman in the closing shop had known something about this. She was not precisely a person who knew old things. She was a person who had been around long enough that the things she'd seen had settled into her the way sediment settles, and she had developed, not through study but through accumulated exposure, an understanding of the nature of certain objects that exist at the boundary between the useful and the perilous. The blanket was one of these. It was not haunted in the way of ghost stories, not occupied by a specific personality with a specific grievance. It was more like a surface that had been, over time, sensitized, a surface that had absorbed the quality of all the disappearing that had happened in its presence, all the people who had pulled it up and pressed their face into its warmth and wished, with varying degrees of sincerity, to be gone. She had sold it to Mara because Mara had come in at the right time, which is to say at a moment of need, and because the blanket sometimes needed someone who was almost gone enough to feel it, but not yet gone enough to be lost to it. The old woman had various theories about this, all of which were too specific and too strange to have been arrived at without some history. She did not always explain these theories. She almost never sold the blanket. She had told Mara, take good care of it. She had meant, in part, take care of yourself with it. She had meant, the blanket will show you something about where you are. and whether that showing helps or harms depends on whether you're willing to look at what it shows. She had meant, don't say the sentence. She had not said all of this because some things, said plainly, produce the opposite of their intended effect. The warned person becomes fixated, becomes curious, begins the very experiment they were warned against. So she had said, take good care of it, and she had folded it in a way that Mara's hands remembered without the mind's involvement, and she had hoped for the best, which is, in the end, what all of us do. The people in the building talked about blanket writhe the way they talked about drafts. Casually, the way you talk about things you can't entirely explain but that have entered the lexicon, that have become part of how a place understands itself. The fourth floor in particular had a reputation, which was vague enough to mean nothing specific but persistent enough to mean something. People on the fourth floor slept heavily. People on the fourth floor had a tendency to stay in. The woman in 4B had not been seen at the mailboxes for 6 weeks once, and when she finally appeared she had a distant quality, the quality of someone returning from a long way away, and she'd moved out the following month without saying much to anyone. The man in 4D used to play guitar in the evenings, and then he stopped, and when someone asked he said he just didn't feel like it anymore, said it with a vague content that was more unsettling than complaint would have been. None of these things were necessarily blanket writhe. All of them might have been. Mara was in 4A, which had not had a long-term tenant in several years. The previous occupant, an older man who'd been a librarian for most of his working life, and who spent his retirement mostly reading, had simply become less and less visible, less and less present in the world. His mail piling up for 2 weeks before the super checked on him and found him in the bed, not dead. This is important. This is part of how it works. Not dead, but deeply asleep. More deeply asleep than sleep. Asleep in the way of someone who has been tucked away with such completeness and such comfort that the body has simply continued in that direction, the most comfortable direction, the direction of not having to wake up. He'd been taken to the hospital, where he'd woken after a day and a half and been entirely unable to explain what had happened. He said he'd been comfortable. He said he'd been sleeping well. He said this without apparent distress, with a kind of warm vacancy, and they'd run tests and found nothing and released him, and he'd moved back into the apartment and slept in the bed for one night, and then moved out permanently to his sister's house in a suburb, leaving most of his books and all of his furniture and the moss-green blanket folded at the foot of the bed in its particular precise arrangement, which Mara had found and thought was simply what the previous tenant had left behind, as previous tenants always leave things behind. This was not correct. But then, this is how blanket writhe works. It doesn't arrive. It's already there. The building's super, who was a practical and largely unreflective man named Arthur, who had worked in the building for 11 years and who had theories about the fourth floor that he kept to himself, because he understood that saying them aloud would make his job complicated, had twice removed blankets from 4A in between tenants and thrown them away, and twice found a blanket, seemingly, though he could not have said how, back at the foot of the bed when the next tenant moved in. He had stopped trying to explain this. He had also stopped going to the fourth floor after dark, which was a policy he'd arrived at through experience rather than superstition, or at least through experience that had not yet crossed the threshold into superstition, which is a finer line than most people believe. Arthur knew, without calling it this, that the blanket liked the apartment to be occupied, that it settled, between tenants, into something like patience, the way a fishing line settles when it's waiting, and that when someone moved in with the right quality, the right combination of tiredness and solitude and the practiced art of making themselves comfortable in a small space, the blanket began doing what the blanket did. He had thought, watching Mara move in with her boxes, that she had the quality. He'd felt sorry about this in the vague way he felt sorry about the fourth floor generally. He had also, in a decision he didn't entirely understand himself, made sure the blanket was at the foot of the bed when she moved in, folded in the particular way that seemed to matter, rather than throwing it away again as he usually did. He had done this because some long-accumulated sense developed over 11 years of being in the building and paying attention, in the way that practical people pay attention, through doing and noticing rather than theorizing, had told him that this one would be okay, that this particular person and this particular blanket would arrive at something other than the usual outcome. He hoped he was right. He would not know for a while if he was. On the night of the email, the job email, the unfortunately email, Mara lay in the bed and felt the blanket doing its work, and she sat up and she unfolded the edge and she said out loud, "I didn't get the job." And the room changed in the way rooms change when something that has been sealed is opened, and blanket writhe, which fed on avoidance, found itself in the presence of the opposite of avoidance, and was uncertain what to do with that, which is as close to disruption as something like blanket writhe can come. It did not stop. This needs to be said clearly. It did not stop because it is not the kind of thing that stops, because it exists in the fabric of certain old woven things, and in the particular quality of human disappearing, and those things don't stop. They're conditions rather than events. But it changed. When the fold was unfolded, and the thing was named, the quality of what it was offering changed. From enclosure to something more like attention, from the warmth of disappearance to the warmth of being witnessed, which are very different kinds of warmth and produce very different outcomes. Mara felt this difference. She might not have been able to articulate it, might not have had the language for what was happening at the level of old fabric and old presence, and the particular alchemy of a person at the edge of their own disappearing, choosing instead to stay, but she felt it. She said, "I'm lonely," and the blanket held this without amplifying it, without offering it back doubled, without producing the particular cruelty of a comfort that exists only to avoid the pain rather than acknowledge it. This is the only resolution Blanket Writhe offers. Not an ending, not an exorcism, not the dramatic liberation of ghost stories, the entity banished, the haunting over, just the nightly practice, the sitting up, the unfolding, the naming, and in exchange for this practice, warmth. Ordinary warmth, the kind that doesn't require your disappearance. She would do this, Mara, on nights when the creeping started. Not every night. There were weeks when the blanket simply lay flat and the heater clicked and the rain came and went and nothing unusual occurred, and she slept with the ordinary imperfection of a person who sleeps imperfectly, and this was fine. But on the bad nights, the nights when she could feel the weight of the unspoken things making itself known in the behaviour of the fabric, she would sit up, she would unfold the edge, she would say the true thing she had been trying not to say. And in saying it, she would remain. She got the next job, not the one she'd interviewed for, not the one whose unfortunately had sat in her inbox for 3 days before she deleted it, a different one she hadn't considered seriously, one that arrived through an unexpected channel, a friend's recommendation, a conversation she hadn't expected to be anything more than a conversation, the familiar surprise of a door, opening where you'd stopped looking for doors. She called her mother, she called her friends, she made coffee and stood at the kitchen window in the new winter light, and felt the particular sensation of forward motion returning, tentative and provisional, but present. She kept the blanket. This might seem strange given everything, but the blanket was, in the end, honest with her, in a way that felt more valuable than a blanket that simply lay there. It showed her where she was. It showed her, with its patient creeping and its stitched borders and its muffled warmth, the exact shape of her own avoidance, and this was information she could use. She learned to recognise the signs, not just the physical signs, the creeping fold, the deepening warmth, the lines forming in the dark, but the internal signs that preceded them, the quality of her own tiredness on a given evening, whether the tiredness had the ordinary character of a day spent or the particular weight of things being pressed down, things accumulating in the place where unacknowledged things accumulate. She got better at this. She got better at catching herself before the blanket had to start reminding her. On the worst days, she still needed the reminder, still needed to sit up in the dark and unfold the edge and say the thing. She had developed a small private practice around this, not dramatic, not ritualized in any elaborate way, just the act itself, the sitting, the unfolding, the naming. Some nights the named thing was small. I'm dreading the meeting tomorrow. I ate badly today and I feel it. I haven't called back and I should. Some nights it was larger. I'm not sure I'm in the right life. I miss people I've lost track of. I don't know who I am outside of what I'm trying to accomplish. These were harder to say, harder to sit with after saying them, but the blanket held them without amplification, without offering them back as permission to disappear, and she lay back, down, and the warmth was ordinary, and she slept. Her mother visited. She slept in the living room on the fold-out, which was adequate if not comfortable, and she and Mara walked through the November city for 3 days, and talked more than they'd talked in years, not about everything, not with the complete transparency of people who have nothing to lose, but with the specific honesty of two people who have decided that they want to actually know each other. Her mother held her hand crossing the street on the second day, which was a thing she hadn't done since Mara was a child, and Mara noticed that she didn't pull away. On the last night of the visit, after they'd eaten and washed up, and her mother was established on the fold-out with a novel, Mara went into her bedroom and sat on the edge of the made bed and looked at the blanket and thought, quite simply, I'm glad it's not worse. This was not the triumphant conclusion. The triumphant conclusion would have had more resolution, more narrative closure, more of the things stories give you in place of the complicated shapelessness of actual experience. But this was what she had, and she found it was enough. I'm glad it's not worse. I'm glad I'm still here. The blanket lay flat. The heater clicked. Rain at the window, because there is always rain at the window in November. That is simply the nature of November. And she sat with it for a moment before getting into bed and turning off the light, and the dark came in warm and ordinary and nothing crept, and no lines formed, and she slept. There are rooms in buildings where the light behaves differently, where the quality of silence has a texture you can feel. where the history of occupation, all the people who have lived and slept and woken and hidden and sought comfort in a space, leaves something in the walls, something in the objects, something especially in the things that touch the body in the way that blankets touch the body, fully, warmly, in the dark. Most of these rooms are perfectly fine. Most of the things left in walls and objects and blankets are simply the ordinary residue of ordinary lives, sorrow and joy, and the great majority of experience which is neither, which is simply the daily texture of being a person, requiring to be fed and rested and connected and occasionally forgiven. This residue is not dangerous. It is not active. It is simply there, the way wood smoke is in an old house, the way the particular smell of a kitchen accumulates over years of meals. Some residue is more specific. Blanket Writhe was specific. It had accumulated in this particular apartment, in this particular blanket, through a particular sequence of occupants who had each, in their own ways, been people who disappeared into comfort rather than being comforted. This is not a moral judgment. It is a description of a process. Each person who had pulled that blanket up and pressed their face into its warmth and wished themselves gone had left something. Not of themselves, not a ghost in the conventional sense, but a quality, a contribution to the collective pull of the thing. And the thing had grown, over time, not larger, but more particular, more attuned to the specific frequency of someone at the edge of their own absence. What Mara had done, what the old woman in the closing shop had understood she might be able to do, which is why she'd let the blanket go with her, was not defeat it, was not cure it, or fix it, or exorcise it. What she had done was more like refuse to contribute to it, to take the warmth it offered without letting the warmth become a destination, to use the comfort as comfort rather than as cover. This was harder than it sounds. It required every time the specific small act of courage that is the naming of a thing, the refusal of silence, the unwillingness to let the unspoken thing become the thing that governs. It required every time sitting up. She sat up. This is the whole of it, really. She sat up. She sat up on the bad nights when the blanket was doing what the blanket did, when the fold crept and the warmth deepened and the stitched lines showed her the shape of her own absence, and she gripped the edge of the fold and she undid it, and she told the truth. She told it to herself mostly, which is where the telling has to start. She sat in the dark with the undone fold and the ordinary cold of a November night coming in past the window, and she said what was true, and the saying of it kept her here, in the room, in the bed, in the life that was hers, even when it felt like someone else's, even when it felt like less than she'd planned, even when it felt, as it would sometimes feel, as it would continue to sometimes feel, because this is how lives feel, like something she had not quite figured out how to live. She sat up. Every time. This is not the resolution of a ghost story. This is the resolution available to people, which is not resolution at all, but practice, the daily returning to the thing that is hard, the daily refusal of the comfortable disappearance. It is not dramatic. It doesn't make a good ending. It makes instead a life, imperfect, continuing, present. Rain settled into the windows in a steady, slow rhythm. The heater clicked on and off with patient timing. In the bedroom, the only real certainty was the bed. Sheets pulled smooth, blanket folded, corners tucked with deliberate care. A woman sat up in it, in the dark, and said the thing she had been not saying, and in saying it remained herself, in her room, in her life, in the world. The blanket lay flat. The warmth was ordinary. She lay back down, and outside the city continued its complicated, noisy, rain-soaked life. And somewhere in the building pipes moved water, and somewhere a door opened and closed, and someone on another floor laughed at something real, and the sound came through the walls and the floor and the ceiling and arrived in this room at 4 a.m. as a small gift, a proof, an argument for staying. Someone is awake, someone is here, someone found something funny in the dark. Mara heard it. She smiled. She slept. The thing about old buildings is that they remember, not the way minds remember, not with narrative or chronology, or the ability to distinguish between what happened and what was feared, but the way bodies remember, in structure, in the particular ache of a joint that was once injured, in the specific way a door swings on its hinges because of how the frame has settled over decades. Old buildings are, in this sense, bodies. They have their histories written in them not as records but as tendencies, inclinations, the way the light falls at a certain angle because of where a window was added in 1953, the way a particular floorboard speaks because of the nail that was never quite right. The 4th floor had its history. The 4th floor had its tendency. This tendency did not end with Mara, because tendencies of this kind are not the property of any single tenant, not expressions of a specific haunting that can be resolved and laid to rest. They are more fundamental than that. They are part of the building now, part of its particular way of being a building, part of what it offers to the people who come to live in it. And what it offered, on the 4th floor, was a particularly good, particularly complete, particularly seductive rest. The kind of rest you sank into and stayed in, and woke from feeling, not refreshed exactly, but emptied, and found you didn't mind the emptiness. Found the emptiness was easier than whatever it was you'd been carrying. After Mara, there was a man named Joel, who was in the middle of a divorce that had been going on for 2 years and showed no sign of concluding. He moved into 4A because the rent was reasonable, and the apartment was clean, and he didn't need much space. He needed somewhere to sleep, he told himself, just somewhere quiet to sleep, while everything else sorted itself out. He brought almost nothing with him. He slept on a mattress on the floor for the first week because his bed frame was in the moving truck that had not yet arrived. When the bed frame arrived, he put the bed together and stood looking at it, and then he pulled the blanket from the closet where it had been left, where Mara had, not quite intending to, left it when she moved out, had left it folded on the shelf, with a quality of deliberateness that she hadn't fully understood at the time, but which now, in retrospect, she would recognise as having been the right choice, and spread it over the mattress, and it lay there, moss-green and heavy and waiting. He slept under it that first night. He woke at 4 in the morning, as the residents of 4A sometimes do. He lay in the dark and the heater clicked, and rain was at the window, and the blanket lay across him with its familiar weight, which was strange because he had only had it for a night, had not, yet had time for anything about it to feel familiar, and yet it did. It felt like the weight of something he'd known for a long time, the weight of something that knew him in return. The fold at the top edge was neat and precise. He lay there for a moment feeling it. Then he reached up and pulled it down. He was not sure entirely why he did this. He had no prior experience with this blanket, no knowledge of what Mara had learned, no old woman in a closing shop to give him even the oblique warning of take good care of it. He had only the instinct, and this is worth noting because instincts of this kind are not random, they arrive from somewhere. The instinct that the fold was too neat, too insistent, that the warmth it was producing was the kind of warmth you wanted to examine rather than accept. He pulled the fold flat. He lay in the dark with the straightened edge against his chin and the rain at the window, and he thought about the divorce which he had been not thinking. But for several weeks, because not thinking about it had become his primary coping mechanism, and he thought, this is not going to work out the way I thought it would. This was something he'd known for months without being willing to say, even to himself, even in the 4 in the morning privacy of his own skull. He had been maintaining a version of the situation that required the outcome to be possible, the reconciliation, the finding of a way through. And this maintenance had cost him something, had required the daily expenditure of a kind of energy he didn't have to spare, the energy of pretending that what he suspected wasn't true. He said it now. He said it in the dark, to the room, and the rain, and the blanket, and himself. It's not going to work out. His voice was flat and matter-of-fact, the tone of someone stating a thing they have known for a long time. The room received this. He lay there for a long time after that, not sleeping, but not in the way that not sleeping usually was for him, not the anxious circling of the mind over the same worn tracks. Just lying there, in the dark, with the thing he'd said settling around him like the rain, occupying the room. After a while, he said, I'm going to be okay. He wasn't sure this was true, not yet, but he said it anyway, not as a wish, but as a decision. The small, specific decision to commit to a version of the future in which it was true, to begin, from this moment, to treat it as a given rather than a hope. The blanket was still, the warmth was ordinary. He slept, finally, the way Mara had slept on certain nights. Not the vanishing sleep that the blanket could offer, not the sleep of someone pulled gently out of the world, but the ordinary and perfect sleep of a person with real things to process, and a real day ahead, and a real life that needed living. He kept the blanket. When he eventually left 4A, 2 years later, for a different apartment, a different part of the city, a different chapter, the divorce concluded, another beginning taking shape in the way beginnings do, slowly and then suddenly. He left the blanket on the shelf in the closet, folded, precisely, in the particular way he had learned to fold it, though he could not have said where the knowledge came from, only that his hands seemed to know. Arthur found it there when he did the turnover clean. He stood in the empty apartment with the folded blanket in his hands, and he looked at it for a long moment, his mouth slightly pressed together in the expression of a man who's made a decision and is checking it. He put it back on the shelf. He had learned in 11 years to trust the building, not unconditionally, not without attention, but with the particular calibrated trust of a person who has paid close attention to something for a long time and has arrived at a working understanding, even if that understanding doesn't easily translate into language. The 4th floor needed occupying. The blanket needed someone who was almost enough gone. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, The almost enough was the threshold at which something changed. It was the point at which someone sat up. He put it back on the shelf and closed the closet and went downstairs. The apartment waited. The rain came and went. The heater clicked in its patient cycles. And in the closed dark of the closet, on a shelf between a wire hanger and a cardboard box someone had left, the blanket lay in its exact fold, moss-green and heavy, warm with the warmth of a thing that has been waiting long enough that waiting is no longer different from being. In the building, the legend went on, whispered at mailboxes, noted in the particular way neighbours note things that don't quite have categories, passed along in the casual, inexact shorthand of people who live in proximity to something they don't have full words for, the 4th floor, the way people sleep there, the way some of them stop going out, the way. Some of them, on the other hand, come through it changed. Not improved exactly, or at least not in the simple direction of improvement, but present in a different way, as if they'd been made more themselves by some process they couldn't explain. Blanket Rythe does not chase you. It waits. And whether the waiting becomes a cage or becomes a mirror depends finally on a single thing. On whether you can bring yourself to sit up in the dark and name what you are most tempted to leave unspoken and remain in the room with the truth of it, warm and awake and hear. The rain continued. The heater clicked. Somewhere in the building, on the 4th floor, in a room where the light came in grey and thin as old paper, a bed was made with the particular care of someone who needed the bed to mean something, and the blanket lay across it in its neat, flat arrangement, and the top edge was folded down in a 2-inch cuff, precise and patient and waiting. Waiting to find out which kind of warmth this would be, always waiting to find out which kind. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The rain had been falling since 9, the kind of rain that doesn't announce itself with thunder or lightning but simply arrives and stays, settling into the city's shoulders like something that belongs there, something that has always been there, and will continue long after the streets dry and the gutters stop running brown. It fell in curtains past the streetlights on Mercer, turning each lamp into a smeared yellow eye, and it ran in thin rivers down the side of the building at 412 Mercer Street, a 6-story walk-up that had been standing since 1961 and looked every year of it. The brick face darkened by decades of weather. The fire escapes painted and repainted so many times the layers had begun to peel back like skin from a bad burn, revealing older colours beneath, greens and blacks, and a particular rust red that had nothing to do with oxidation. The building had 14 units. On the 3rd floor, in apartment 3C, Mara Voss was awake. She had been awake since before the rain started, lying on her back in the dark with her eyes open, tracking the shadows on the ceiling the way children track shapes in clouds, finding faces in the plaster, animals, the suggestion of hands. Her bedroom window was cracked an inch despite the cold, and she could hear the city doing its usual late-night business, the distant compression of a truck's brakes, the particular hollow sound of a metal grate being rolled down over a storefront, someone's music from 2 or 3 floors above carrying a bass line through the building's bones. Then the rain started and covered all of it, and she lay there listening to the rain instead, which was better in some ways and worse in others, because rain had a quality of continuation to it, a patient, purposeless insistence, and it made her feel the same quality in herself, awake past reason, continuing past reason, serving no particular purpose in the dark. At midnight she got up. She didn't turn on the bedroom light. She knew the apartment by feel now, 6 months in, had learned it the way you learn a body. Its particular obstacles and clearances, the dresser that jutted 2 inches farther than you'd expect, the bathroom door that swung hard to the left if you didn't hold the handle. She moved through the dark bedroom and down the short hall and into the kitchen, where the window over the sink looked out onto the airshaft between her building and the next, a narrow vertical channel that funneled the rain sound into something almost musical, a steady sustained chord that varied slightly as the wind shifted. She didn't turn on the kitchen light either, not at first. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust, and the kitchen resolved around her. The small table with its 2 chairs she'd bought second-hand, both a slightly different shade of oak. The counter with its accumulated ordinary objects, the drying rack, the block of knives, the ceramic canister set she'd inherited from her grandmother and felt ambivalent about. The window above the sink fogged at the edges with condensation, the centre still clear enough to show the dark airshaft beyond, the opposite building's brick wall glistening with rain. The kettle on the back left burner, squat and steel grey, a simple thing. Mara padded to the sink and filled the kettle. This was the ritual. It had started in college, the habit of late-night tea, and she'd carried it through every apartment, every city, every version of herself she'd inhabited since. The filling of the kettle, the setting of it on the burner, the blue click of the igniter catching, the small reassuring circle of flame. It was a sequence that meant something like, the night can be managed. It meant you can give yourself this one small thing. It was the kind of ritual that only worked if you didn't look at it too directly, the way certain stars disappear when you stare straight at them, but reappear in peripheral vision. She set the kettle on the burner and turned the knob. The igniter clicked 3 times before the flame caught, blue and steady. She lowered it to medium and stepped back and leaned her hips against the counter opposite, arms folded, watching the flame's small discipline beneath the kettle's base. The kitchen window fogged more as the warmth built. She watched it happen the way she often did, the condensation advancing from the edges toward the centre, the glass going opaque in stages, the view of the airshaft disappearing behind a translucent film that turned the opposite brick wall into a dim, wet glow. When the window was fully fogged, the kitchen felt more enclosed, more private, as if the walls had moved inward by a few feet. She had always liked this effect. It felt like the apartment was closing itself around her in a protective way, drawing the curtains, reducing the world to this small lit space. She got her mug down from the cabinet. It was a wide-bodied mug, hand-thrown, with an uneven rim and a glaze that had gone slightly, matte over years of use, her favourite for no articulable reason except that it sat well in 2 hands and the weight of it felt right. She set it on the counter beside the stove and got out the box of tea, the same kind she'd been buying for years, the orange and white box, the chamomile with a hint of something smoky underneath that she'd never been able to identify. Then she waited. The rain came down in the airshaft. The flame burned below the kettle. The kitchen was quiet in the way only late-night kitchens are quiet, a quality of quiet that has texture, that is different from afternoon quiet or evening quiet, more interior, more like the quiet inside a held breath than the quiet of simply being alone. Mara stood with her arms folded and looked at the kettle and thought about her day in the fragmentary, involuntary way thoughts come at midnight, when you're tired but not sleepy. The meeting she'd half participated in, the 3 emails she'd sent and then wished she could unsend, the lunch she'd eaten at her desk in 7 minutes because it felt indulgent to take longer, the conversation with her sister that had ended badly, not badly dramatically, just badly in that particular way where nothing was resolved and both people knew it and hung up anyway. She thought about the project she was behind on and the presentation she hadn't started, and the fact that she'd told herself she would exercise 4 times this week and had done it once. She thought about the way her upstairs neighbour walked across the floor, the heavy deliberate stride of someone who lived emphatically in their body, the way it came through her ceiling at odd hours. She noticed she was doing it again. The inventory, the cataloguing of evidence for the case against herself, assembled nightly, admitted without question, sentenced without appeal. She tried to stop. She looked at the kettle and listened to the rain, and tried to simply be in the kitchen at midnight, a person waiting for water to boil, which was a simple and neutral thing to be. The kitchen window had fully fogged by now. The glass was a grey-white opacity, and in the centre of it, where the condensation was thickest, a small oval had appeared. Not fogged like the rest, but clear, as if a palm had been pressed against it from the outside and then withdrawn, leaving a brief porthole. She looked at it without much interest. Windows did things like this. Condensation was uneven, formed in patterns that looked deliberate and weren't. She turned back to the kettle. The water was beginning to shift, the small sounds of convection becoming audible, a low stirring beneath the metal, the system waking. She had always found this sound calming, the early stage of boiling, when the water is merely thinking about it, running through the preliminary work of heat exchange before committing to the full transformation. There was something in the progression she found clarifying. First nothing, then stirring, then the building, tremor of real heat, then the whistle, things following their nature, physics doing what physics does, the sound built. Then something changed. The building sounds, the low gurgling of water on the edge of serious heat, arrived at the point where the whistle should have started. The kettle's spout began to vibrate. She could hear it, the thin metal membrane at the end beginning to oscillate, beginning to form the whistle's precondition. She straightened against the counter, waiting for it. It didn't come. Instead, the sound held. It hovered, exactly at the threshold, a trembling sustained note that was almost a whistle but not, a note that carried all the tension of sound about to resolve, and then didn't, a note that kept its incompleteness the way a question keeps its upturn, the way a hand extended in the dark keeps its openness without knowing if it will be met. Mara tilted her head. She had heard kettles make noise before, obviously, and she had heard the particular sound of a kettle working up to its whistle, but she had not heard this. This note had a quality of intention to it, a quality of waiting, as if the kettle were paused at the edge of completion on purpose, rather than by mechanical accident. She took a breath, and the note seemed to lift, just slightly, a fraction of a tone, as if registering her inhalation. She exhaled, and it lowered. She breathed in again. The note lifted. She breathed out. The note came down. She stood very still and breathed again, slowly, and watched the note follow her breath like a dog follows its owner, faithful and patient, matching her rhythm with an attention that made the hairs on her forearms lift. She was not a person who scared easily, or who credited apartment buildings with personality, or who put stock in the specific vocabulary of ghost stories and urban legend. She was a person who worked in urban planning, who thought in systems and grids and load-bearing structures, who had an almost physical resistance to magical thinking. So she stood there and breathed and listened to the note moving with her breath, and told herself there was an explanation for it, that steam behaved in ways that mimicked coincidence, that she was tired and her perception was unreliable at midnight with the rain coming down and the inventory still running quietly in some back partition of her mind. She breathed. The note moved with her. She became aware of the steam. It was coming from the kettle spout in a thin, steady thread, the way steam always comes, except that it was not dispersing in the way steam always disperses. It was gathering, not rising and spreading and thinning into invisibility the way normal steam does, but rising and very slightly cohering, the thread of it bending and folding and building a shape in the air above the spout, a shape that had no edges and no resolution, but that her eyes, in the way eyes work, were finding faces in, a curve that suggested a forehead, two darker concentrations that suggested, not eyes exactly, but the places where eyes would be, the shadows of eyes, the implication. The shape lasted 3-4 seconds, a loose and foggy impression of a face, soft and formless as a thought you almost had. Then the draught from the cracked window caught it, and it dispersed. She exhaled. The note lowered. She stood in the kitchen with her arms no longer folded, hands at her sides, fingers slightly open, and she looked at the kettle and she thought, this is not the first time something like this has happened. That was the true and frightening part. Not the steam, not the note matching her breath, but the sudden surfacing of a memory she had filed away and not examined. 6 weeks ago, on a different rainy night, she'd woken at 2 a.m. with her hands very cold and found herself in the kitchen without knowing exactly how she'd gotten there, standing at the counter with both palms pressed flat to the surface, the kettle already on the burner, already hot, already in that pre-whistle state, already making a sound she had told herself, in the morning, had been a dream. She looked at her mug. The mug sat on the counter where she'd set it, empty. But on the countertop beneath the mug's base, spreading outward from it in a perfect circle, was a warm ring, the precise signature of a full mug, the heat transfer mark of hot liquid inside ceramic pressed to laminate. She bent and looked at it more closely. She touched the ring with her fingertip. It was warm, not hot, not body temperature, but warm in the specific way a surface is warm after something hot has rested on it. The mug was empty. It had been empty since she'd set it down. She picked it up and held it and felt, unmistakably, quietly, wrongly, warmth at the rim. The inside of the rim, where a mouth would go. A warmth that had no business being there, that was inconsistent with the mug having sat in a kitchen cabinet for hours before she'd retrieved it. Not scalding, not aggressive. Gentle. The warmth of something that wanted to be drunk. She set the mug back down. The note from the kettle continued, patient and held at the edge, rising and falling in small increments with her breath. The fog on the window cleared in another small oval, slightly larger than the first one, slightly more centred, the approximate shape and placement of a face held up against glass from the outside. The air shaft beyond was visible through it for a moment. Wet brick, the vertical channel of rain, the dark opposite wall, and then the condensation moved back in and covered it again, slowly, the way skin heals over a small cut. Mara said, "What do you want?" She said it to the kettle, which was absurd, and she knew it was absurd, and she said it anyway because the kitchen felt like a place where speaking directly was the appropriate response to the situation. The note held. The steam thread from the spout continued its thin, rising line. She looked at the flame under the kettle, blue, steady, burning correctly, doing what flame does. She looked at the burner knob and thought about turning it off and leaving the kitchen and going back to bed and telling herself in the morning that this had been a strange dream, that she had been half asleep on her feet the way people get at midnight. That sound and steam and condensation had conspired in her exhausted perception to produce a moment of apparent strangeness that had a mundane explanation she would find if she thought about it clearly in daylight. But the warmth was still in the mug. The ring was still on the counter. The note was still synchronized with her breath. She did not turn the burner off. She did not leave the kitchen. Instead, she did what she always did when the inventory got too loud, and the night got too long, and the evidence against herself piled too high. She said quietly to the empty kitchen, "I'm fine." She said it automatically, reflexively, the way you say it without deciding to, the way it comes out of you before the thought that produces it is finished forming. A sentence she had used so many times and in so many contexts that it had become less a statement than a sound that meant, close the subject, a sound that meant, this doesn't require attention, a sound that meant, the door is shut. The note stopped, the steam dispersed, the window fog settled into ordinary condensation, unmoving, without the strange oval clearings. The kitchen was exactly what a kitchen is at midnight, with a kettle on the stove and rain outside. Ordinary, slightly cold, smelling of chamomile and metal. Mara stood in the quiet and waited for the whistle. It never came. The kettle sat on the burner with the flame still underneath it and the water inside it hot. She could hear it. The water was unquestionably hot. The gurgling of fully heated water was audible, but no whistle came. The note was gone, and nothing had replaced it. Not completion, not the clean resolution of a proper boil. Just silence where the whistle should have been. Suspended silence. The kettle holding its hot water without releasing it, without the sound that should have followed, the way a scream holds in a chest just before it becomes a scream. She turned the burner off. The flame clicked out. She stood in the dark kitchen with the cold coming in through the cracked window, and the rain in the air shaft and her mug on the counter with its ghost warmth and its ring. And she poured the tea from the now silent kettle because the water was hot anyway, and the bag steeped, and she held the mug in both hands and drank it, standing up, and it tasted like nothing, or rather it tasted like tea. Always tastes when you're not really there, when the act of drinking it is only going through the motions of comfort rather than receiving any. She went back to bed. She lay in the dark with the rain still falling and thought, I'm fine. In the kitchen, the kettle cooled. In the morning there were 3 rings on the counter, perfect circles of warmth impression. Dried now, slightly discoloured. She hadn't put the mug down 3 times. She had put it down once. She didn't tell anyone about the kettle. This was not a decision she made consciously. It was more that the category of things she reported to other people had boundaries she maintained without inspecting them too carefully, and the kettle fell outside those boundaries the way a lot of things did. The way the 2 in the morning appearances in the kitchen fell outside them, the way the inventory fell outside them, the way the particular quality of her insomnia fell outside them. Not because they were shameful exactly, but because reporting them required a kind of admission she wasn't ready to make, which was that she was not always fine. But some nights the ordinary objects of a kitchen became strange to her, and she stood among them in the dark, unable to explain herself even to herself, so she went to work on Thursday and did her Thursday things, and came home and made dinner and did the dishes and talked to her sister, briefly, a shorter call than usual, and went to bed at 11:30, which was early for her. She was asleep by midnight, which was unusual. She woke up at 2:14. The kettle was already making the sound. She could hear it from the bedroom. The almost whistle, thin and sustained and patient, finding its pitch in the dark apartment, coming through the wall between the kitchen and the hallway, with a clarity that suggested it had been building for a while, that it had not just started but had been there for some time at the edge of her sleep, incorporating itself into whatever she'd been dreaming, and she was awake now because the note had reached a pitch that no longer allowed sleep. Not because it was loud, but because it had entered some frequency that bypassed the ears and went directly to the part of the brain that monitors for wrongness. She lay in bed and listened, rise and fall with her breath. She got up. In the kitchen, the front left burner was on. She had used the front left burner for dinner, pasta with the large pot, and she had turned it off. She had turned all the burners off. She was careful about this. She was the kind of person who checked the burners before bed, a habit instilled by a college roommate who'd left a burner on for 6 hours once, and they'd come home to a kitchen full of a thin, shimmering heat and a faint smell of gas. She was certain she had turned them all off. The front left burner was on. The kettle sat on the back left burner, which was also on, and the water inside was at that exact trembling threshold, and the note was coming from the spout with its quiet, sustained persistence, and the steam thread was rising and gathering above the spout, and there it was again. The face shape, softer than before, more diffuse, less a face than the place a face would be, the volume of air where features would be placed if something were there to have them. She stood in the doorway and looked at it and said nothing. The note moved with her breath. She walked into the kitchen and looked at the mug on the counter. There were 4 rings on the counter beside the drying rack, not where she'd left the mug the previous night, but arranged in a loose arc, as if someone had been picking the mug up and setting it down in different positions, rehearsing it, practicing the gesture of comfort. The rings were warm, fresh. She looked at the window. The fog had done the oval clearing 3 times. She could see the overlapping shapes in the condensation. 3 clearings of slightly different sizes, as if whatever was pressing against the glass from the other side had tried 3 times, learning something with each attempt. She stood in the kitchen and breathed. The note moved with her breath. She said, "I know." She didn't know what she meant by that. She said it anyway into the kitchen and felt it was true. The note held. She looked at the burner knob and thought about the rules she didn't know yet, the specific sequence of actions that would close this properly, the way all stories of this kind have a sequence. Not because the universe is moralistic, but because rituals require form, and form requires sequence, and some things in the world respond only to their proper form, the way locks respond only to their specific keys. She didn't know the rule yet, but she understood she was inside a situation that had rules, that there was an appropriate response and that she had been giving the wrong one. She turned the burner off. The flame clicked out. The note lingered. 1 beat, 2 beats, falling slowly like a note on a piano after the key is released, the sustain pedal still down, then faded into the kitchen's quiet. She stood in the quiet. She put both hands around the empty mug, not to do anything, not to perform, just held it. The empty ceramic cylinder, wide and hand-thrown and slightly irregular. The glaze gone matte from years. The rim she could feel under her thumbs, the specific weight of it. She held it the way you hold something you've been carrying for a long time when you finally set it down on a table. Not with relief exactly, not dramatically, but with a simple acknowledgement that it has weight, that it has been in your hands, that your hands have been around it. She held it for one full breath. Inhale, slow. Exhale, slow. And in that breath, in the specific quiet of the kitchen with the rain in the airshaft and the burner off and the steam dissipating, she thought, one small kindness. Not a program, not a self-improvement plan. One small kindness tonight, right now, for no reason other than that it was midnight and she was tired and the night had been long. She thought, I don't have to answer the emails tonight. That was it. That was the thing she found. A small, true thing, unremarkable in scale, enormous in the resistance she had built against it over the course of the previous 6 hours during which she had checked her email 4 times after dinner and started responses she hadn't finished and felt guilty for not finishing them, and felt guilty for checking in the first place, and felt guilty for feeling guilty. The recursive machinery of self-accounting that ran in her without being asked, without being fed, generating judgment from nothing, endlessly productive. She did not have to answer the emails tonight. They would exist in the morning. They would be answered in the morning. She did not have to earn sleep by completing the day's ledger first. She held the empty mug, held the breath, let the breath go. The kitchen felt, not fixed, not transformed, nothing so complete or cinematic, slightly less watchful. The air shifted. The window fog settled into ordinary condensation without clearing in any particular shape. The kettle sat on the burner, just a kettle, just metal cooling in the natural way of things. She filled it again. She set it back on the burner and turned it on, and this time the water built to its proper boil with a clean, conventional progression. The small sounds of heating, the gathering tremor, the full whistle, sharp and uncomplicated, arriving without hesitation. She poured the tea. She held the mug in both hands and felt warmth in her palms and let the warmth be what it was. She stood at the kitchen window, which had fogged again in the ordinary way, and she drank her tea. The rain fell in the airshaft. Her upstairs neighbour's footsteps tracked across the ceiling, a single pass, unhurried, then silence. The city outside did its late things. She finished the tea. She rinsed the mug. She went back to bed. In the morning, the counter had 1 ring on it, perfectly normal from the mug she'd set down once. This would be, in a reasonable story, the end of it. The lesson learned, the ritual completed, the haunting resolved. The apartment returning to its benign function as a container for ordinary life. Mara would carry the small knowledge of it, that warmth extended is warmth received, that refusing kindness has a cost, that the kettle responds to honesty, and the knowledge would serve her quietly on nights when the inventory ran long and the rain came down and the familiar sentence tried to close the door. But 412 Mercer Street had 14 units, and the story did not confine itself to 3C. Downstairs in 2B, there lived a man named Carver Osman, 52, who had been in the building for 11 years and knew it the way a doctor knows a long-term patient, with a familiarity that had long since crossed into something like indifference, the kind of intimacy that has stopped noticing what it knows. He was a large man who had been larger, a structural draftsman who worked from home and kept careful hours and ate dinner at 6 every evening without variation, and was in bed by 10:30. He was not a person anyone in the building thought about very much. He was the kind of neighbour who is appreciated, primarily through absence. No noise complaints, no packages delivered to wrong units, no late-night music or arguments. He was simply there, had been there for 11 years, would presumably be there for 11 more. His name was on the buzzer panel downstairs in a handwriting so regular it looked typeset. He had lost his son 14 months ago. The son's name had been Declan, 26, a teacher, killed in an accident on the interstate, but Carver had never been able to say the full sentence of "in the 14 months since." Who was? He could not complete it, had not completed it, not in conversation, not in his own interior monologue, so that the fact of it existed in him as a permanent unfinished sentence, a clause without a main verb, his son who had been 26 and a teacher, and who had, and then nothing, the sentence breaking every time. He had not cried since the first week, not because he was past it, not because he was processing it efficiently, not because he had resources or a support structure that was serving him well. He had simply locked the room and kept walking. It was the only technique he knew, learned from his own father, a man who had built his emotional life on the same plan a ship is built. Double-hulled, compartmentalized, so that a breach in one section doesn't flood the whole. You shut the compartment, you keep the ship moving. He kept the ship moving, he worked, he ate at 6, he slept at 10:30, he spoke to his sister once a week on the phone, and said the word "fine" so many times per call that it had ceased to be a word and become a recurring sound, a placeholder, a way of using the space where information would go. He made tea every evening at 9, the same kind his wife had liked before she'd left, 8 years ago now, before Declan had grown and moved out and started his life. The same orange and white box, chamomile, which Carver did not particularly like but had been buying for 8 years out of a habit so deeply grooved it had passed through habit, and become something more structural, something he did the way he kept the double hull. On the Friday night, 3 weeks after Mara's kitchen event, Carver was in his kitchen at 9, making his usual tea. The apartment was dark except for the kitchen light, a single fluorescent tube that Carver had been meaning to replace for 4 months. It buzzed slightly, had a 2-second flicker every few minutes, made the kitchen feel interrogatory, institutional. He didn't notice it anymore. He filled his kettle at the sink and set it on the back burner and stood at the counter sorting through the mail he'd brought in from the lobby that afternoon, and not yet looked at. Circulars mostly, a bill, a notice from the building management about the upcoming boiler inspection. The boiler inspection notice made him think of the building's basement, which he had been in once, years ago, called down by the super to deal with a small flooding issue near his storage unit, a dark low-ceilinged space that smelled of mineral deposits and old insulation, where the boiler sat behind a chain-link enclosure and sweated and hissed, and the pipes ran across the ceiling in every direction like a diagram of something's nervous system. He had not liked the basement. He didn't think about it often. He put the notice on the pile for recycling, and stood with the bill and looked at it without reading it. The kettle began its progression. He heard the small sounds of water heating, the stirring, the building frequency, and he waited for the whistle without directing much attention at it. It was background. It was the reliable percussion of the evening ritual, no more remarkable than the refrigerator's compressor cycle, or the elevator's cable moving in the shaft behind the wall. The whistle didn't come. He noticed the absence the way you notice a clock stopping in a room you've been in for hours. Not immediately, but in a delayed way, with the strange sensation that something has been wrong for longer than you realised. He had been sorting mail. He was still sorting mail. The kettle should have whistled 2 minutes ago. He looked at it. The almost whistle was there, thin and patient and aligned to his breath, and he heard it and set the mail down very slowly, the way you set something down when your body has registered a problem before your mind has caught up. He watched the steam build above the spout. He was not a person who frightened easily. 11 years in a building, every creak and click and groan of the place catalogued and explained. The steam pipe's percussion in winter, the second-floor hallway's light that tripped its own breaker every 6 weeks with inexplicable regularity, the sound that came from 4A on certain nights that turned out to be a woman who sang opera in her sleep. He had explanations for all of it. He was a draftsman. He believed in load and force and dimension and the specific tolerances of materials. He did not, as a philosophical position, believe in things for which there was no load-bearing explanation. He watched the steam gather into its face shape. He stood in the kitchen with the fluorescent light flickering its 2-second flicker and the face shape in the steam, and the note moving with his breath, and he experienced a sensation he had not experienced in 14 months, which was the complete cessation of the double-hull system. Not a breach in one compartment. All compartments at once, no longer functioning. The ship taking on water through every wall simultaneously. He put his hands on the counter and held on. The steam face was not Declan's face. He needed to be clear about this with himself, in the kitchen, holding the counter at 9 in the evening. It was not a face at all. It was a concentration of steam vapour that his grieving and exhausted and isolated visual cortex was finding features in, the same way you find faces in wood grain or clouds, or the patterns of bathroom tile, pareidolia, a neurological artifact of the system's tendency to prioritise face detection above almost every other cognitive function. It was not Declan. It was not Declan. The almost whistle rose with his breath, fell with his breath, rose with his breath. He was crying. He discovered this the way you sometimes discover you've been crying without deciding to, finding your face wet and your throat working around something that hadn't announced itself as grief, but arrived as grief. He had not cried in 14 months. His face had apparently been waiting. His throat had apparently been waiting. He stood in the kitchen with his hands on the counter and the fluorescent light flickering and the note moving with his breath, and he cried in the kitchen at 9 in the evening, which was not the kind of thing Carver Osmond did. The steam face held. Then, slowly, like a thought completing, it dispersed. He stood in the kitchen crying, and the note continued, and the mug was on the counter, and the ring of warmth was spreading beneath it, and the window was doing the oval clearing, and he said, "I miss him." He said it into the kitchen, to the kettle, to the steam, to the night and the rain that had started again. It had been raining all week, every night, the city having one of its wet periods, and the words were the first true words he had said in 14 months. True in the sense of being aligned with something real inside him. Not fine, not moving forward, not okay, but I miss him, which was true, which was exactly and completely true, which contained no manoeuvre and no protection, and no double hull. He stood in it. After a while he turned the burner off. He put both hands around the empty mug. He breathed. He thought, one small kindness. He could not call his sister. Not tonight, not at 9, not in the state he was in, not with the sentence still unfinished in him. But he could. And this was the kindness. Exactly as small and exactly as real as it needed to be. He could take tomorrow off. He was his own employer, worked for himself, set his own hours. He had not taken a day off since before the accident, had worked straight through the days immediately after, through the funeral and the clearing of Declan's apartment and the weeks and months that followed. Because work was the double hull, work was the compartment that stayed functional, work was the thing he did instead of the thing he couldn't do. Tomorrow he could not work. He could simply be in the apartment with the rain, without the spreadsheets and the drafting software and the structured forward motion of professional obligation. He could sit with the unfinished sentence and not demand that it finish. He held the mug. He breathed. One full breath. The kitchen settled. The note was gone. The window was ordinary. The fluorescent light flickered once more and then, for no electrical reason, stabilized. Held its light clean and steady, the buzz extinguished. He made the tea properly. The kettle on the burner, the water building to its clean whistle, the whistle arriving fully, no hesitation. He poured it. He sat at his kitchen table, which he rarely sat at, preferring the couch, and he held the mug in both hands and drank the tea he didn't particularly like, and outside the rain fell with its patient, purposeless insistence, and he let it. He did not finish the sentence. Not tonight. But he let the sentence exist inside him without locking the compartment, and it was different from the compartment. It was not better, but it was different, more accurate, more honest about the shape of the thing. In the morning he did not work. In 4A, the woman who sang opera in her sleep was named Giulia Ferrante. She was 38, a cellist in the city orchestra, Italian by birth and New York by most of her adult life. A small, angular woman with wire-frame glasses and a quality of attention that made people feel when she looked at them that they were being considered in their entirety. She had lived in 4A for 3 years and knew the building well enough to know its sounds. The steam pipes, the elevator, the man downstairs who walked across his floor with emphatic steps, the woman in 3C who ran her kettle at midnight. The opera she sang in her sleep varied. Her roommate, before the roommate had moved out in January, had reported it with affectionate precision. Mostly Verdi, occasionally Puccini, once an extended passage from something that had sounded. The roommate said, like Wagner at the bottom of the sea. She herself had no memory of it. She slept deeply, the sleep of someone who spent her days in physical and intellectual demand, and the sleeping opera was a thing her body did independently, as if there were a second Julia who lived at the back of the first one and came out only when the front one was sufficiently out of the way. She was not insomniac. She was not in crisis. She was, by her own assessment, doing well. The season was going well. She had a solo coming up in March that she was prepared for. She had friends she saw and dinners she attended, and a romantic situation she described to those friends as complicated but fine. She was fine. She used the word naturally and without resistance, meaning it, or meaning something in the vicinity of it. Something close enough. She had a habit, though, that she'd carried since conservatory. When a piece was giving her trouble, not technical trouble, but interpretive trouble, the deeper problem of not knowing yet what she meant by it, not having found the centre of it yet, she would stay up late with a mug of something warm and play the passage in her head, without her cello, just thinking through it. letting it iterate in her internal ear, which was precise and reliable, better sometimes than the instrument at showing her the skeleton of what she was trying to do. The Elgar was giving her trouble, not technical trouble. She had the notes, she had the bow weight and the vibrato and the intonation. She had it technically in a way that was almost the problem. She could play it correctly without playing it true, and the difference between correct and true was the thing she was trying to find. Lying awake at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in March with the rain starting up outside her window, and the Elgar concerto cycling through her internal ear. Correct and not true. Correct and not true. A performance without a centre. She got up at midnight. She went to the kitchen. She filled the kettle. She turned on the burner. She leaned against the counter and let the Elgar run in her head and listened to the kitchen's quiet and watched the window fog and thought, it is about loss. The Elgar, everyone agrees, is about loss. Written in 1919, after the war, after the world Elgar had known had been destroyed and replaced with something he didn't recognise and couldn't find himself in. The technical demands are not the point. The technical demands are the frame around the loss, the skeleton. The grief hangs on, and if you play only the skeleton, you have a correct performance that is not a true one. She knew this. She had known this for months. Knowing it hadn't helped her find it. The almost whistle began. She heard it and straightened slightly and listened with the precision she brought to all sound, the professional's inability to hear passively. The note was interesting. It was sitting on a pitch she'd heard before. She was certain she'd heard before. It was sitting on the same pitch as the Elgar's opening phrase, the cello's first entrance, which began on a note of such particular quality, such specifically loaded colour, not quite E-flat, sitting somewhere in the cello's voice where the instrument sounds most like a human throat. The almost whistle was on that pitch. She tilted her head. It moved with her breath. She breathed carefully, in for 4 counts, out for 4 counts, the way she breathed, before an entrance on stage, and the note moved with her counts, rising on the intake, falling on the release, matching her the way a phrase matches a breath in singing, the way a well-written phrase has the length of a natural breath so the performer's body can live inside it, she said quietly to the kitchen. The steam gathered above the spout, the face shape, loose and without features, the mere volume of a face. She looked at it with the same objective attention she brought to everything. It lasted longer than she expected, holding its approximate coherence against the kitchen's small air movements, and she had the strange thought that it was listening, that the face shape in the steam was doing what she did in the rehearsal room when a fellow musician was playing, holding still, holding attention, holding itself in a quality of reception. She looked at the mug, the ring on the counter, the warmth at the rim. She understood in the professional part of her mind what was happening in the same way you understand a musical phenomenon, not by explaining it away, but by recognising its form. This was a form she recognised. She had played it before, in a different key. The window's oval clearing appeared. She looked at it. She thought about the Elgar. She thought, the problem is that I am playing it correctly because I do not want to play it true. Playing it true requires something I have been keeping in the technical frame, something I have been managing at arm's length with bow weight and vibrato. If I play it true, I have to let it be about what it is about. She stood with the almost whistle moving with her breath, and thought about what the Elgar was about. Not just loss in the abstract, not the cultural loss of a generation's idealism, not the war, not even Elgar's specific grief, but loss as she knew it. Her mother 4 years ago. The specific kind of loss that is not dramatic, but is permanent, that does not resolve in any of the ways resolution is supposed to work, that lives in the body as a subtle atmospheric pressure rather than an acute wound, or whether you carry rather than an injury you recover from. The cello solo in the first movement is a throat clearing itself to speak. She had known this. She had not been playing it. She put both hands around the empty mug. She did not think about it as a ritual. She simply held the mug because holding something warm, or something shaped like something warm, was what the moment required. She breathed. The note rose. She thought, one small kindness. And she laughed. A small involuntary sound. Because the kindness she found was not what she expected. Not rest. Not permission. Not the practical accommodation she sometimes offered herself in the language of self-care. The kindness was this. She was allowed to play the Elgar true. She was allowed to let the grief in there be her grief, and not Elgar's grief, and not a historical grief at a safe remove. She was allowed to be the instrument through which this particular human frequency passed, which was what she was. It was her function. It was why she had trained for 22 years, and why she sat in the first chair, and why the audiences came. Not to hear correctness, but to hear a human body make contact with a piece of music in a way that allowed something in the audience to vibrate in recognition. She had been withholding herself from her own instrument. The kindness was the permission to stop. She held the mug, breathed once, let it go. She turned the burner off. The note faded. 2 beats of reluctance, then gone. She relit the burner. The water came to a clean, full boil. The whistle arrived with a clean decisiveness. She made the tea. She held the mug in both hands and felt the warmth correctly. Warmth, and not as anything else. She sat at her kitchen table and let the Elgar run in her internal ear, and this time it had a centre, and the centre was a throat clearing itself to speak, and the speaking was not decorous. At the next rehearsal she played it true. The conductor stopped the orchestra and looked at her over his score and said nothing for a moment, then said simply, "There." None of them knew about each other. This is important. Mara in 3C, Carver in 2B, Julia in 4A. They shared a building, shared walls and ceilings and the building's particular sounds, but they did not share what had happened in their kitchens. They carried it in the private way people carry things they cannot fully explain, filed in the category of experience that resists language, that loses something in the telling, that belongs to the interior the way the interior belongs to itself. But the building knew. 412 Mercer Street knew its residents the way buildings do, which is to say, structurally, through load and frequency, through the small vibrations of human habit transmitted through floor and ceiling and wall, the weight of a step, the resonance of a voice, the specific frequency of grief or relief, or the particular tension of a person standing in a kitchen at midnight trying to decide whether comfort is permitted. Buildings accumulate this. Old buildings especially. They hold it in their materials the way wood holds the shapes it grew in, the way stone holds the water that moved through it. The accumulation is not memory exactly. It is more like tuning. A building becomes tuned to its residents, becomes calibrated to their frequencies, begins to resonate at the same pitches. And Tikapors, which was what the story called it, and stories knew it by the name they carried, the name passed sideways in buildings, in laundromats, in the particular conversations that happen in the stairwell at 2 a.m. between residents who can't sleep and don't know why. Teacuppers was not a separate thing from the building. It was the building's tuning finding its expression in the specific frequency of comfort and the refusal of comfort the moment you almost let yourself be warm and then don't, the moment the kettle reaches the edge of whistling and you say, "I'm fine," before it can complete itself. It didn't live in the kettle. It didn't live in any single kettle. It lived in the habit. It lived in the space between the hand reaching for warmth and the sentence that closed the door. In 5C, on the 5th floor, in the corner unit with a window that looked down onto Mercer Street rather than into the airshaft, there lived a woman named Rhea Park, 29, who had not been sleeping for 5 weeks. Not insomnia in the Mara sense, not grief in the Carver sense, not the meaningful wakefulness of an artist finding her way through a problem. Rhea Park was not sleeping because she had stopped eating enough, and her body had registered this as an emergency condition and was keeping certain systems online that needed to be offline for sleep to happen, and the systems being kept online were primarily the ones dedicated to alertness and threat detection, so that every time she started to drift, the animal part of her brain fired up with its catalogue of unaddressed dangers, and she was awake again, her heart doing 65, her body ready for something it couldn't name. She was, by the standards of most observable metrics, fine. She was employed, she was functional, she answered emails and kept commitments, and presented in meetings and made the sounds of a person who was doing okay, and they were convincing sounds because she had been making them for a long time, since before the 5 weeks, since a time she couldn't precisely locate when she'd started to understand, without deciding to understand, that her hunger was something she could manage, that the management of it was something she could be good at, that being good at it had a value she could not clearly articulate, but which felt structural, load-bearing, an achievement against which the day could be measured. She had been in the building for 8 months. She had not bought a kettle. On the Friday night of the 6th week at 11, she was in her kitchen not to make tea but to drink water, which she did drink. Water she permitted herself freely. She poured a tall glass from the tap and stood at the counter drinking it and looking at the window, which faced the street and showed the rain-lit amber of the city's wet night sky, the reflections of the street lamps in the puddles on Mercer 4 stories below, the occasional late pedestrian with an umbrella. She heard the sound. It was not coming from her kitchen. It was coming from somewhere inside the building, through the wall or the floor or the ceiling, not loud, not insistent, but clear, a thin, sustained note at the edge of something, a note she recognised without knowing why she recognised it, a note that sat in her chest with a quality of familiarity that made no sense because she had never heard it before. She stood at the counter with her glass of water and listened. It moved, slightly, rose and fell. She became aware that it was moving with her breath. Not possible, she thought. It's coming through the wall. But it moved with her breath. She breathed slowly and it moved slowly. She breathed faster and it moved faster. She stood in the kitchen at 11 on a rainy Friday night and breathed, and the note from somewhere inside the building moved with every breath she took. On the counter beside her glass, where nothing had been a moment ago, there was a mug. It was not her mug. She had 2 mugs in the cabinet above the coffee maker, both given to her by her mother at different times, a blue one and a green one. This was neither. It was a wide-bodied mug, hand-thrown with an uneven rim and a glaze gone slightly matte from use, a particular kind of mug that looks like it belongs to someone who's been using it for years. It sat on her counter as if it had always been there, and beneath it, spreading from its base in a perfect circle, was a ring of warmth. She looked at it for a long time. She reached out and touched the rim. Warmth. Genuine warmth. Not imagination. Not the heat of a palm briefly applied. The warmth of something that had been held, repeatedly, by someone who needed it. She stood in her kitchen on the 5th floor, and the note from somewhere below moved with her breath, and the mug sat on her counter with its ring of warmth and her glass of water in her hand, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, which was seen. Not in a good way, not comfortably. Seen in the way of a thing you've been hiding very carefully being noticed anyway. Seen in the way that makes the hiding visible, makes the careful architecture of concealment suddenly apparent as architecture rather than landscape. The structure of it exposed. She felt it in her throat and behind her eyes and in her chest, with a pressure that was not comfortable, and was not what she would have said she wanted. She set down the glass of water. She picked up the mug with both hands. It was empty. She held it. The note through the wall moved with her breath. She held the mug and breathed and thought about one small kindness, which was a phrase that had surfaced in her mind without origin, without attribution, a phrase that was simply there in the kitchen with her the way the mug was there. One small kindness. She stood in the kitchen and tried to find it, the way you try to find a word at the edge of memory, the way you circle towards something that keeps moving. She tried. I can go to sleep now, but it didn't feel true, because sleep was not hers to give herself. Sleep happened or didn't based on conditions her body set without consulting her. She tried. I can eat something tomorrow. But this one felt like a contract rather than a kindness, the language of it already contaminated with the management system's vocabulary, the conditional future tense of a bargain she'd already made and broken a dozen times. She stood with the mug and breathed. The note moved. The window was fogging at the edges, the amber street glow softening behind condensation, the city going gentle and blurred. She thought, I am not fine. It was not what she'd been trying to find. She had been trying to find a kindness and had found instead an honesty, which was not the same thing, but which might, she held it in the kitchen, testing it, which might be the same thing. For her, in this kitchen, tonight. That the one small kindness available was the withdrawal of the sentence, the removal of the lid, the acknowledgement that the door she'd been closing every time comfort appeared was not keeping her safe, but was keeping her in the dark, and she was tired of the dark. She was genuinely and thoroughly tired of the dark, and that was real. That was the most real thing in the kitchen, more real than the mug or the note or the warmth at the rim. I am not fine. She held it. One breath. She did not relight any burner. There was no burner involved in. The kitchen tonight. No kettle. No flame. But the note through the wall faded as she breathed out slowly, over 2 beats, then silence. The mug in her hands was just a mug again. Someone else's mug. Hand thrown on her counter for no explicable reason. The warmth at the rim persisted, and she held it a moment longer, then set it gently on the counter beside her glass. She did not sleep that night. But in the morning she called someone. She called a number she'd had in her phone for 4 months, filed under a name that was a description rather than a person, the description being resource for when things are not fine, and she'd never called it because things were always fine, she was always fine, there was nothing to report. She called it in the morning in her kitchen with the winter light coming in through the street-facing window, and the puddles on Mercer drying in the pale sun, and the mug still on the counter, still there, still real, still unmistakably someone else's, warm at the rim in a way that should not have been possible overnight. She made an appointment. The mug was gone when she came home. She looked at the spot where it had been, and there was only the ring on the counter, the warm impression of its base, and she stood and looked at it for a moment and felt neither frightened nor relieved, but something in the vicinity of both, something that had the quality of being correctly perceived, of seeing yourself clearly in a mirror rather than the softened version, and finding the accurate reflection neither flattering nor condemnatory, but simply true. She did not replace it. She did not go to the kitchen cabinet and get out the blue mug or the green mug and hold one of them in both hands on the theory that the form of the thing could substitute for its function. The form of the thing was not the point. The point was the warmth. The point was the receipt of it. She drank water and went to bed and slept 6 hours, which was not enough, but was more than 5 weeks of almost nothing. Here is what I am going to tell you about the building now, and I am going to tell it directly rather than sideways. The building had been keeping this for a long time. Not tikapors. That was a name for a thing people encountered in their kitchens and needed to call something. The building itself had been keeping something older than the name, something that had lived in the structure since the 1960s, or maybe before, since the ground it was built on, since the specific intersection of Mercer and 4th, which had been, before the apartment building, a rooming house, and before the rooming house a different kind of dwelling entirely, and at each stage of its existence the building or its predecessors had been a place where people lived alone with their habits, where the habits of late-night rituals accumulated in the walls, where the specific frequency of comfort and its refusal had been playing long enough to tune the building to it. None of. This is to say the building was malevolent. It was not malevolent. It was patient, and patience can look like malevolence from certain angles, especially when you're inside it, especially when you are the thing being waited for. But its waiting was not hostile. It was more like the patience of a thing that understands the rhythm of a process and is not trying to accelerate or resolve it, but simply holding space for it, the way a room holds space for what happens inside it, undemanding, present, there. The almost whistle that lived in the building's kitchens, and all 14 units had heard it, at one time or another, at midnight or 2 in the morning, or the specific hour when the night is most itself, the hour that knows you're awake and doesn't ask why. The almost whistle was not a sound the building made. It was the sound the building recognised, the sound of a person at the threshold, at the exact edge, the kettle about to complete itself and the person about to allow completion, the moment before the sentence that closes the door. The building knew this sound the way a body knows the sound of its own name, and tikapors held it there, kept the threshold open, made the moment longer than it would otherwise be, lingered in the trembling note, stretched the instant of almost into a space large enough to examine, not to force a choice, not to coerce comfort, just to make the option visible, to make the reflex of refusal slow down, long enough to be seen as a reflex rather than a truth. In apartment 1A on the ground floor lived a 67-year-old man named Percival Oduya, who had survived things I will not list here because the list would take too long, and because listing them is not the point. The point is that he had survived them, and was living on the ground floor of a building on Mercer Street, and kept his kitchen clean, and made jollof rice on Sundays, and spoke to his grandchildren on video calls every Saturday morning with a quality of attention and tenderness that his grandchildren understood, even the youngest ones, as a form of love that had been refined by difficulty into something very pure, very spare, without decoration but structurally sound. He had the kind of tenderness that comes from having been very hard and then choosing, deliberately, to become soft. Not the default softness of a person who has never had a reason to harden, but the earned softness of someone who has hardened and then understood, at cost, what hardening costs. He made tea every night. He was the most practised resident of 412 Mercer Street at the Ritual, the one who had been doing it the longest and with the most consistency. 40 years of nightly tea, the habit preceding the building, preceding his arrival in this country, carried from a different kitchen on a different continent, the same sequence: fill the kettle, flame the burner, wait. He had never heard the almost whistle. The almost whistle had never come for him. It came for the people who were refusing something. Percival Oduya was not refusing anything. He was not pretending to be fine when he was not fine. He had learned, the hard way and at cost, that pretending did not serve, that the sentence "I'm fine" used as a lid was a lid on the wrong jar, that the jar kept its contents regardless of the lid, and the contents were not improved by confinement. He had learned this at 50, 55, at 60, each time at cost, and by 67 the learning had become something more like a practice, like the jollof rice on Sundays and the grandchildren on Saturdays. A thing you do because it is true to your nature to do it, because the alternative has been tried and found insufficient. His kettle whistled cleanly every night. He poured his tea. He sat at his kitchen table, which had been in his family since before he was born, a different continent, a different kitchen, the table surviving everything the same way he had survived everything, without drama, without insisting on its own survival, simply by continuing to be a table. He sat at it and drank his tea and let the night be the night. His kitchen had no fog on the window, not in the strange way. His window fogged normally, condensation from the tea's steam, dispersing in the natural way of condensation. His mug sat on the table and was picked up and set down in the normal sequence. The burner beneath his kettle did not remember his breath. He did not know this. He had nothing to compare it to. He drank his tea and went to bed and slept well. But there was one more resident. In 6A, on the 6th floor, at the top of the building, alone in the corner unit that had the best view and the worst water pressure, lived a man named Thomas Weil, 44, who had moved in 9 months ago following a divorce, and who was not, in any of the ways he would have described himself, a person in distress. He was employed. He was functional. He had friends and a social life and a gym membership. He used. He drank moderately. He ate well. He called his kids, 2 of them, 11 and 8, living with his ex-wife 3 miles away, every day, and saw them every other weekend, and was by his own and most external assessments, managing the divorce with competence and grace. He was also awake every night between 2 and 4. He did not get up. He lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and waited for it to pass, the way you wait out a storm in a shelter, not in panic, not dramatically, just patiently, and without much interest, waiting for the 2 to 4 window to close and give him back his sleep. He had been doing this since before the divorce, since about a year before it, since the period when the marriage had been clearly ending but they hadn't said so yet, hadn't named it, still operating under the terms of an arrangement whose expiration they could both see, but neither had agreed to acknowledge. He had been lying awake between 2 and 4 since then, and the lying, awake had outlasted the marriage's ending, had continued through the separation and the signing and the moving out, and the 9 months in 6A, persistent, loyal, as if it had no relationship to its original cause, and had become by now simply his 2 to 4. He was in his kitchen at 2:30 on a wet Tuesday. He did not make tea. He stood at the kitchen counter and drank water and looked at the city from the 6th floor window, the best view in the building, the full grid of Mercer and the cross streets visible in both directions, the rain turning the street lamps into elongated stars, the city looking, from up here, like something you could understand if you looked at it correctly. He heard the note. It was not coming from anywhere he could locate. It was not directional in the way sounds usually are. It was simply present in the kitchen, the way a quality of light is present, pervasive, sourceless, part of the atmosphere of the space. It was the almost whistle sustained at the edge of completion, and it moved with his breath, and he stood at the kitchen window drinking water and breathing and let it move. He was not frightened of it. He had been in the building long enough to know, without knowing he knew it, that this was a building sound, one of its frequencies like the steam pipe's winter percussion, or the elevator cable's particular hum. He didn't question it. He just breathed and let it move with him. On the counter, no kettle. He hadn't filled one, but there was warmth coming from the counter beside the empty mug he'd left there from morning tea. Warmth from the counter itself, from the laminate, as if the surface was slightly heated from beneath. And there was a ring. He looked at the ring and at the warmth and at the empty mug and he thought, okay, so that's happening. He thought it with a quality of equanimity that was not indifference, but was close to it in texture. The equanimity of a person who has lost enough already to have recalibrated, his relationship to surprise. Things happened. Kettles made sounds that moved with your breath. Counters were warm in the night. Buildings were strange. Life was strange. He was 44 and divorced and lying awake every night between 2 and 4, and the world was stranger than it looked in daylight. He put both hands around the empty mug. He didn't perform it. He didn't decide to do it. He just did it. The way you sometimes find your hands doing what the situation requires before your mind has consented to it. He held the empty mug at 2:30 in the morning in his kitchen on the 6th floor, with the rain on the window and the note moving with his breath. He thought, one small kindness. He stood with it for a long time, longer than one breath, longer than the others had stood with it, turning it in his mind the way you turn a problem in a dream, finding unexpected geometries, facets you hadn't seen from other angles. One small kindness. He realised, genuinely unsure. What this would be. He had been so competent, so functional, so graceful in his management of the loss, that he had not left space for the loss to be a loss, had not left room for the fact that he was grieving something, that divorce is a death of a particular kind. Not a person dying, but a version of yourself dying, a version of your life that you'd believed in, and built toward and inhabited for 16 years, dying at 44, and there was grief in that. Actual grief, with weight and colour and its particular demand of being felt rather than managed, and he had been managing it at a competence level he was proud of, in the way you can be proud of something that is also costing you everything. One small kindness. He stood at the counter and breathed. He thought, I am allowed to miss it, not perform missing it, not narrate missing it to himself or others in the careful language of emotional intelligence he had learned. Just miss it. Specific texture of a shared life. The weight. Two people's habits combined into a household. The sounds of a morning with children in it. He was allowed to miss this without the missing being a verdict on how he was doing, without the feeling of loss being evidence that he was failing at the recovery. He could miss it and still be okay. He could miss it and still be the father who called every day and showed up every other weekend. He could miss it and still be tomorrow, the functional, competent, graceful version of himself that he was proud of. He could miss it tonight. The note dropped, slowly, over several beats. not cutting off, just ending, the way a long note ends when the bow reaches the end of its length, and the sound naturally resolves into silence. The window was ordinary. The counter was just a counter. The mug in his hands was just a mug. He stood in the quiet of the kitchen at 2:30 and missed what he missed, and let it be what it was, a real thing, with weight and colour taking up the space it actually took, up rather than the space he'd been assigning it. After a while, he went back to bed. He slept until 7. In the weeks that followed, in the normal progression of a building's life, things continued. Mara finished her report and sent it, and received a response that was better than she'd expected, and she did not spend 3 hours passing the response for evidence of its inadequacy. Carver took several days off in March, not one day but several, an accumulation of them, days he spent in the apartment with the rain, and the unfinished sentence and the slow and genuinely terrible work of sitting with grief rather than administering it. Julia performed the Elgar in late March to an audience that sat in a particular quality of silence afterward, the silence of people who have been reached, before the applause started. Rhea went to her appointment, and then another, and then several more, and the process was not easy, it was not quick, and was not the clean resolution the story's shape might suggest, but she went, and going was what it was, a real and repeated act, as real and repeated as the almost whistle in the building's kitchen walls. Thomas slept between 2 and 4, not always, not yet. But the window was narrowing, the building stood on its corner of Mercer Street and held its 14 units, and accumulated the frequencies of its residents, with the patient indifference of a structure that has been standing since 1961, and intends to keep standing. The rain came and went. The steam pipes knocked in winter and fell silent in spring. The elevator cable hummed its single continuous note in the shaft behind the walls. And in the kitchens, on certain nights, rainy nights especially, the nights that had a particular quality of continuation and patient insistence, the almost whistle could be heard, thin and sustained, sitting at the edge of completion, moving with the breath of whoever was awake and standing at the counter, with a mug in their hands and the familiar sentence at the edge of their mouth, the lid waiting to be placed. Some nights the sentence came out and the lid went on, and the note hung in the kitchen through the rest of the night, moving with every breath, patient as rain, as persistent as the habit it was keeping vigil for. And the steam built its face shape in the spout's thread, and the mug left its rings on the counter, and the window cleared its oval, and everything stayed suspended, maintained at the edge, the comfort always almost there. Some nights it didn't. Some nights the burner went off and the hands went around the empty mug and the breath went in and the breath went out, and the one small kindness was found. Not the same kindness twice. Not a formula, but always something specific, always something real, sized precisely to that night and that person, and that particular habit of refusal. And the kitchen settled, and the note faded, and the window became ordinary, and the water came to a clean boil, and the whistle arrived. Properly, clear and uncomplicated, the sound of completion, of a thing arriving at its natural end. I need to tell you what happened in December, because December is when it stopped being a building story, and became something else, something that required being told the way you tell things that have consequences, the way history is told, with the weight of what it changed kept visible in the telling. In December, in apartment 3A, next door to Mara, sharing her kitchen wall, a man moved in named Jordan Baird, 27, recently relocated for a job, knowing no one in the city, carrying 2 suitcases and a box of kitchen supplies, and a folding table he'd bought from a big box store that required assembly, and that he assembled alone on his first night in the apartment, on the floor, with a headlamp, because he hadn't thought to buy a lamp, and the apartment's ceiling fixture was broken, and the super was not available until Monday. He assembled the table in the dark with the headlamp, and ate a protein bar sitting on the floor beside it, and sent his mother a text that said, "Moved in, all good," with an exclamation point he had chosen deliberately as a sign of positivity, and which had cost him something to include. He was fine. He texted this too, to his mother, to his 2 close friends in the city he'd come from, to his co-worker who'd asked at the end of his first day, settling in, okay? He was fine. The new city was fine. The job was interesting. The apartment was small, but fine. He was fine, 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 the word coming out of him in every exchange like a small reliable currency, backed by nothing, spending easily, accumulating in the conversations of the people who received it, without any of them registering that it was unbacked, that there was nothing in reserve. He made tea on his 4th night, with the kettle he'd brought from his old apartment, a different kettle from the others in the building, stainless, cylindrical, with a gooseneck spout because the night was cold and the apartment still felt unoccupied even with him in it, still wearing the previous tenant's air, the particular atmosphere of an empty space that has not yet been reclaimed by new life. and tea was what he made when he wanted the space around him to feel less like a holding pattern. He stood in the kitchen on his fourth night and waited for the water to boil. The note came quickly for him. He heard it, the almost whistle, sitting on the edge, not completing, rising and falling with his breath, and he felt it land in his chest in a specific way, in the specific register he recognized because it was his register, the frequency of a person who was very tired of being fine, and who did not know yet that there was another option, who had been operating the fine system for so long that the system had become invisible, had become what he thought of as his personality rather than what it was, which was a structure he'd built over something that needed different conditions and structures. He was, on his fourth night in the apartment, more alone than he had ever been. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that would have been legible to someone looking at him. He looked fine. He looked like a 27-year-old standing in his kitchen making tea in a new city, which was a normal thing, a fine thing. But underneath the fine, 4 nights of sleeping in a new place without a person or animal or familiar sound to calibrate the new space's wrongness, 4 days in a new job with new people and the performance of competence and positivity that new situations demand, 4 evenings in a small apartment on a street he didn't know, eating takeout at a folding table, scrolling through his phone to simulate the texture of connection, sending texts with exclamation points into a city he'd left, and being received by people who were busy with their own lives and who responded with warmth, but not with the specific warmth of proximity, of being in the same room. The note moved with his breath. The steam gathered its face shape. He looked at it. He looked at the ring on the counter. He looked at the mug's warmth. He said, and it came out of him before he could stop it, the way a cough comes out before you can be polite about it. I don't know if this is fine. He stood in the kitchen and let that sit. I don't know if this is fine, he said again, quieter. To the kettle, to the steam, to the kitchen, to the building, and whatever the building held in its walls, the note held. He touched the warm ring on the counter with one finger. He thought, one small kindness. He could call someone, not text, call. He could call his mother, whose voice he had not heard since before the move, who sent him texts with exclamation points of her own, who had cried when he left and said you'll be great with a conviction that was also a kind of grief. He could call her tomorrow, not with a report, not with an update, not to say I'm fine, but to hear her voice and let her his and let the call be what it was, which was, I miss you, expressed in the form of a phone call. He held the mug with both hands. He breathed once. The note fell, slowly, cleanly, into the kitchen's quiet. He turned the burner off and relit it, and the water came to a proper boil in minutes, and the whistle was clear and full, and he poured the tea and stood in his kitchen, and held the warmth in his hands and let it be warmth, received without conditions, without owing anything, without needing to have earned it first. He called his mother in the morning. Here is the thing about the building that I've been moving toward the whole time. The thing the story is actually about, which is not teacup oars. Teacup oars is only the name, and names are not the things they name, but the habit. The one the building had been tuning to for 60 years, the one that lived in every kitchen at midnight, and every resident who had ever stood at a counter with a kettle on the burner and the familiar sentence forming. The habit of saying I'm fine when you're not is so old it predates language. It is older than the specific words. It is a posture, a way of orienting the body and the face and the breath toward the world that communicates. Not a problem, keep moving, nothing to attend to here. It evolved because the world required it, because admitting need had costs that sometimes outweighed the benefit of having the need met, because the economy of vulnerability is unsteady, and most people have been charged more than the market rate at least once and learned from it. The habit is not wrong. The habit has uses. The habit keeps you upright on days that require you to be upright, and you cannot afford to be otherwise. The habit is part of the double hull that keeps the ship moving, but the habit does not know when to stop. That's the problem. The habit is a good worker with no concept of the end of the workday. It will keep the lid on indefinitely. It will say I'm fine to the kettle, to the steam, to the warmth offered at midnight by the specific gravity of a building that has learned your frequency, and then it will take the warmth away, turn the comfort into a simulation of comfort, a ring on the counter where the mug was but the mug never actually there. Teacup oars is not what feeds on this. I have been telling it as if there were a thing outside you that keeps the threshold open, a presence in the steam, and the note and the warm ring, and there is something. The building is real, the tuning is real, the frequency is real. But the suspension, the keeping of yourself at the edge, that is the habit's work. The almost whistle is the sound of a person who is almost letting themselves be okay, almost accepting the warmth, almost saying, tonight I will allow this. The almost is the habit's product. The habit suspends the completion the way a composer prolongs a resolution, except without the intention toward eventual resolution, without the promise of arrival. Just the prolonging, indefinitely, the maintenance of the almost as a permanent condition. And what Tika Pause does, what the building does, what the tuning does, is make the almost audible, make the suspension visible, make the withheld warmth tactile, present, warm at the rim, so that the refusal of it cannot be unconscious, cannot pass through without being noticed, cannot happen with the automatic efficiency of a habit that has made itself invisible. It makes you see what you're doing. That's all. Whether you then do something different is yours. On a Sunday in late December, Mara was in the laundry room on the basement level of 412 Mercer Street, the basement that Carver had been to once, years ago, low-ceilinged and mineral-smelling, the boiler behind its chain-link enclosure. The laundry room was off the main basement hall, better lit than the rest of the basement, with 4 washers and 4 dryers and a folding table in the particular atmosphere of shared laundry rooms everywhere, which is the atmosphere of intimate domesticity conducted in a semi-public space, strangers' clothes tumbling together, the laundry of other lives on display. Julia was there already, holding a cotton sweater with the focused attention she brought to everything physical. Carver was loading the second washer, moving slowly, the way he'd been moving since March, a pace that was less hurried than it used to be, less efficiently directed, as if he'd decided to let the distance between actions be a real distance rather than something to be minimised. Jordan was sitting on the folding table doing something on his phone with one earbud in, waiting for his dryer cycle to finish. None of them knew in any explicit way what the others had experienced in their kitchens. But they were all in the laundry room at the same time on a Sunday afternoon, which happened sometimes in buildings, the rhythms aligning, the orbits of separate lives intersecting at the practical, hubs of shared infrastructure, and they were together in the way residents of a building are together, which is a specific kind of together, proximate, familiar with each other's sounds and schedules, and the broad strokes of each other's existence without knowing the interior of it, sharing a building the way cells share a body, each with its own function, the whole not requiring them to coordinate but benefiting from their coexistence. Julia said, to the room in general, folding, "Does anyone else hear the kettle sound at night?" The room went quiet in a way rooms go quiet when something true has been said. Carver finished loading the washer and didn't turn around immediately. Jordan took out his earbud. Mara said, "Yes." And then they were talking, the 4 of them in the laundry room with the washers going and the building's particular mineral smell and the low ceiling and the fluorescent tubes, talking about it, not explaining it, not collectively rationalising or debunking it, but talking about it with the honesty of people who have already been through the private part of the experience and have arrived at the other side of it, where the thing can be named without being diminished. Julia said, "It sits on the pitch of the Elgar's first entrance." She said it matter-of-factly, a musician identifying a frequency, and then said, which I think is not a coincidence, although I cannot explain why. Carver said, "It was my son's favourite sound." He meant the specific note, not the kettle. He meant a note his son had been able to produce by running a wet finger around the rim of a wine glass when he was 7 years old, a trick Declan had learned from a cousin and performed at every family dinner for 3 years with absolute delight. Carver said, "I had forgotten about the wine glass until the kitchen." He said it simply, without drama, the way you report something you found after losing it. Jordan said, "I think I needed it to be obvious." He said, "I'm good at not noticing when I'm not fine. I needed it to be more obvious than I could not notice." Mara said, "Me too." The washers went. The building breathed around them, upstairs, on each floor, in each kitchen with its kettle and its burner and its late-night window. Percival Aduya, in 1A, pouring his clean ordinary tea. Rhea Park in 5C sitting at her kitchen table with a full mug, a meal on the counter, evening light coming through the street window. Thomas Weil in 6A, whose 2 to 4 had narrowed to 2 to 240 and was still narrowing. The building stood on its corner of Mercer, and accumulated its frequencies and tuned itself to its residents, the way it had been doing since 1961, patient and structural and without demand. And here is what Teacupples keeps when you dismiss comfort. Keeps the moment. The exact moment. The steam still in the air, the note still in the spout, the warmth still in the rim. Keeps all of it in suspension, preserved at the instant of refusal so that the refusal doesn't actually close anything, doesn't actually conclude anything, doesn't allow the story to end in the way you intended when you said "I'm fine." You said "I'm fine" to close the subject, but the subject doesn't close. The moment persists, suspended in the building's walls, in the kettle's silence, in the rings on the counter, in the fog of the window clearing and re-clearing its oval. Always the same oval, always the same approximate size and placement. The size and placement of a face held up against glass from outside, patient and without features, waiting. You will make the tea again tomorrow night, or the night after, or on the next rainy night when the comfort is called for and the ritual begins. The kettle will heat, the note will hover at the edge, and the moment you almost accepted warmth and then didn't will still be there, will be there again, offered again with the same patient persistence that rain has, the same purposeless insistence, because Tika Paws doesn't want your pain. It doesn't feed on your refusal. It doesn't punish you for saying I'm fine or reward you for saying I'm not. It is not moralistic, and it is not sentimental, and it does not have an agenda beyond the single function it has been performing since before it had a name, which is holding the door, keeping the door from closing all the way, keeping the warmth from receding entirely, keeping the rim warm in the empty mug until the next time you pick it up, so that when you pick it up, tonight, tomorrow, the night after, whenever the note finally aligns with a moment of genuine willingness, the warmth is there. It has been there all along. It has been waiting at the exact temperature required, the temperature of something meant for you, kept for you, patient as the rain, uncomplicated as the whistle that arrives when you let it. The comfort doesn't fix everything. Comfort doesn't need to fix everything. It just needs to land, quietly, correctly, like a blanket, settling. Like warmth in the palms of both hands, like one breath taken and released in a kitchen at midnight with the rain in the air shaft, and the window cleared and the building quiet and the note, finally, gone. Outside, the rain. The rain drapes the night in a steady hush, and the city continues its business, and the windows of 412 Mercer Street glow in their various ways, some dark, some warmly lit, some fogged in the ordinary manner of a heated interior meeting, cold glass. The building stands on its corner the way it has stood since 1961, double-hulled against the weather, its 14 units holding their 14 versions of the private life, their 14 arrangements of habit and loss and warmth, and the particular discipline of getting through the night. In the kitchens, the kettles. In the kettles, the heat. At the edge of the heat, patient and thin and sustained at the exact frequency of a breath. The almost whistle, always there, always ready, always holding the door, waiting for you to stop calling it unnecessary. Waiting for you to let it be what it is, which is what it has always been. Not a haunting, not a judgment, not a lesson to be learned and applied and checked off. Just warmth, offered, staying warm until you're ready. Just the moment before the kettle whistles, held open as long as you need, the duration of one breath, or 10, or the full length of a rainy season. The duration of your willingness, the duration of your return. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. Rain had turned the whole neighbourhood into something that didn't quite belong to the waking world anymore. Mara knew this street. She'd walked it 100 times in daylight, knew the house with the wind chimes made from old silverware, knew the yard where someone had been attempting a vegetable garden for 3 consecutive years with increasingly philosophical levels of failure, knew the particular give in the sidewalk near the Hendersons' driveway, where a tree root had been pushing up through the concrete for so long it had become a landmark rather than a hazard. She knew this street the way you know a place you've never paid much attention to, which is to say she knew its shape without knowing its character, the way you can live next to someone for years and know their car but not their name. In rain, at 1:30 in the morning, she didn't know it at all. The water had changed everything's relationship to light. Dry concrete absorbed the amber glow of the street lamps and gave nothing back, but wet concrete held the light on its surface like a skin, throwing it forward in long, distorted ribbons that stretched toward her and away from her simultaneously, so that the street appeared to be offering her a direction she hadn't chosen. The puddles were everywhere. Shallow ones near the curbs where the drainage was poor, deeper ones near the drain at Vennick and Ash, where something had been partially clogging the grate since September, and the city hadn't gotten around to it. Mara had submitted a maintenance request. She had submitted it twice. The puddle remained. She was wearing the grey t-shirt she'd slept in the previous night, tried to sleep in, or worn while lying horizontally in the dark performing sleep without achieving it. Soft joggers with a fraying drawstring she kept knotting and unknotting absent-mindedly. The old canvas sneakers that had gone soft and shapeless from years of exactly this kind of use. Not exercise, not occasion, just the habitual walking she did when staying inside became a specific kind of suffocation. She hadn't taken her phone. She'd thought about it, stood in the hallway with the